order. Are we good now? Okay, I'll try it again. On the meeting order for the April 27th study session. Madam Clerk, roll call, please.
The record will reflect that Mayor Pro Tem Muldoon is currently absent.
Great. We're going to turn to current business. The first item is clarification of items on the consent calendar. Councilmember Brenner, do you need any clarification on any of the items? Councilmember O'Neill? None. Councilmember Dixon?
None.
Councilmember Blom?
None.
Councilmember Duffield? And I have none. And our next item, 2, Poppy Month proclamation, will be continued to a future meeting. And that allows us to roll right into our next item, the discussion about the initial draft of the general plan housing element update. And I believe we have a report.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Avery and City Council members. I'm Simone Jurgis, your Community Development Director, and with me I have Deputy Director Jim Campbell. We also have members of the planning staff with us, in addition to Chair Larry Tucker. He was chair of your Housing Element Update Committee, who will talk at the end of our presentation. I want to go ahead and just jump to our PowerPoint. We do have, it's about 35 slides, but it's going to go rather quickly. Just want to talk about a little bit about background, how we started all this. And if you remember, back in 2019, we really focused on the general plan update. The council at the time formed a steering committee. They had about 12 meetings back in 2019, and then our RENA numbers came out, and we quickly pivoted to the focusing on the housing element. We've had 13 meetings on the housing element. So combined over the last 2 years, we've had about 25 meetings, Brown Act meetings, to talk about general plan and housing. With regards to public workshops, we've definitely did a lot of engagement with the public, including during the steering committee. We've had a workshop in each of your city council districts. In addition to once the housing committee was working on the housing element, we've had about 5 additional workshops, public workshops. And unfortunately, we were stuck with COVID, and so a lot of it was Zoom, but you could see from the participation rate, it was pretty good. It was pretty good compared to how we handled went through that steering committee. Did a lot of advertising, a lot of outreach. We wanted to come back and tell you we've done everything we think we should do and everything we can, including utility bill inserts and trying to get that word out about the housing element because it's such an important document, and it is the community's document, and so we wanted to make sure we got the word out. Mayor Avery, you talked about it during your city council comments too, so we've done as much as we can with outreach. Just talking a little bit about the housing element, you formed a housing committee, and their first meeting, and unfortunately was a little delayed, was in July. And you saw previously we had a lot of outreach that took place. And we finally drafted our first draft of the housing element. We released that to the community on March 10th. Since that time, we've gotten feedback from the community members, we've gotten feedback from our housing committee members, and we've gotten input from the planning commission. And all that is part of the agenda item this evening. It's included as in your agenda. I want to talk about RENA, and we've talked about this before, and that table there talks about that 4,800 units and how we distribute those housing units to kind of a broad spectrum of income levels. And you can see there, just that first line, very low income from 0 to 50% of area median income. We need to plan for at least over 1,400 housing units that's going to serve that part of the population. The AMI, or the area median income, is not the Newport Beach median, but it's the county median. And so there's actually a monitoring that takes place to monitor that these housing units are meeting that threshold. And so the document you have before you, the housing element, is actually a document that has opportunities for these housing units. And they have policies, and think of policies as just action items, stuff we have to do to encourage affordable housing. So continue with that discussion with our housing element in RENA. So that top line there, you see our very low income, and moderate. Those 3 are the big challenging categories we've got to plan for. But we actually get credit for stuff that's in the pipeline. These are projects you've already approved. This is Newport Crossings. This is the Saunders project, Airport Village project. We have a project in the Cole area. We have Uptown. a lot of these projects that are still in the pipeline, we actually get credit for. And you can see that project in the pipeline row where the above moderate is over 2,000 units. So again, the above moderate are easy. It's that very low and moderate, that's hard for us. In addition, we get a little bit credit for what's in our fifth cycle. So the agenda item, for clarity, the agenda item tonight, the draft, is a sixth cycle. The stuff we've done in the past that we're implementing now is the fifth cycle. We actually have some housing units still in that fifth cycle that we're going to get credit for, and we're going to ask for credit. In addition, for the ADU projections, we've doubled based on some of the council feedback. I know the council would like to talk more about ADUs, but our projections for ADUs are included in that. So when you do the math, when you take that top row and subtract all that credit, that bottom row in green, that remaining need, that's what we have to plan for. And that's what our housing element is going to do. So I want to talk a little bit about what is that development potential. Well, it's really a capacity for growth. Right? What is that capacity? You also have, and I should have mentioned this, I did print a copy of the presentation for all the council members, and there's a few copies up there at the entrance. But back to development potential, it is that capacity for growth. We don't build housing. The city is not in the development business, but we plan for those opportunities to allow for housing to take place. So you select the sites, and then you have policies to encourage that development. I'm going to skip this slide because a lot of this sometimes is repetitive. I'm going to focus on slide 10. So if you remember when we talked about the steering committee and those outreach meetings that we did in each of your council districts, during those meetings, your community members took those Lego bricks and placed them on the city map to identify where those housing units are going to go. So that's the basis of how we do our housing element. Our housing element update committee are the ones that took these individual sites and looked at each parcel, each EPN, and tried to determine what's suitable and what's feasible for development. Not everything is going to be feasible for development. You can't take a Class A office building that has full tenants and think that's going to get torn down in the next 8 years. So that's what the housing committee focused a lot of attention on. What is reasonable that these properties will turn over for housing units? So here's kind of the step-by-step process, and I think it's important that we kind of walk this through. So the housing committee selected these sites, and the communities kind of selected those areas. And step 2, we have to estimate of those parcels we looked at, what percentage is reasonable to turn over to housing. So what you see are opportunities, but you can't assume 100% of all these properties are going to turn over in the next 8 years. That's not reasonable. So we make an assumption of what is reasonable that it'll turn over to an actual housing unit. And so and Jim Campbell here is going to talk about some of that allocation. And those units that are going to turn over for housing, you also make an assumption about what level of affordability for a specific area. So you have to make these assumptions based on our consultants' input, based on HCD's input, and so we made these assumptions, and that what kind of spits out the compliance or those units that we've determined. In addition, we have to figure out density. So just to keep it back in the back of your mind, our average density for some of our kind of older development is probably in the 20s, 20 units per acre, 25 units per acre. Now with this kind of extreme number of housing units, we're going up, doubling that, to the 40 dwelling units per acre, to the 50 dwelling units per acre. Those are very high densities. We don't usually see that in this part of town. We have some projects that have kind of tapped into that, but it's not normal. This housing element is forcing us to kind of look at these higher density units. And you plug all this into a spreadsheet and you come out with your housing development potential, and that's what you're going to see here shortly. I want to kind of highlight here our community was the ones that really focused on where to put those housing units. And you can see those 6 areas starting from the top, the airport area. We have Banning Ranch, which continues to stay on our books and our general plan. West Newport, we're going to talk about. Dover, Westfield, Westcliff, we have a little bit there. Newport Center, we'll talk about, and also Coyote Canyon. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jim Campbell. He's going to talk about the allocations that we've gone through with the housing committee.
Thank you, Simone. So I want to start off here with the airport area. It's an area that currently has a mixed-use designation, but as we focused in on providing the RENA units at the densities that we're looking at, we started to expand our thinking because we felt that we needed additional sites because the RENA is quite large. So this was one of the focus areas that the community kind of settled us in on, and as Simone indicated, the Housing Committee, led by Larry Tucker, looked at each one of these parcels to make an assessment of, well, is it really going to happen? Is it feasible? Could we expect to see development there? You see these shaded parcels. There are parcels that are currently designated for housing or mixed use, and there are other areas that are not currently slated for housing. There are also some parcels there, the golf course parcels on Irvine Avenue there. And so there are some additional areas that we're thinking about here. So the assumptions here, we basically identified 158 acres, the projected redevelopment 27%. So that's important to understand. You know, we don't expect all these parcels to develop during the next 8 years. We are looking at a 50 dwelling unit per acre a limitation here. That's our planning assumption, and that was comes from the current general plan, which in the airport area allows up to 50 dwelling units per acre. It's also important to note that you folks are familiar with the term density bonus, where a developer can come in and ask for additional density in exchange for building affordable housing. And so these densities and units that you're seeing here on all these charts do not include density bonus. And so based on these assumptions and a 45% very low and low income and a 15% moderate income, you know, we arrive at some unit yields in the low and moderate and above moderate income category for 1,960 units. Moving forward, the West Newport Mesa area. This is really generally described as the area behind Hoag Hospital up near Costa Mesa to get your bearings. So we've got a variety of industrial parcels here. We've got the city's parcels as well, a couple of mobile home parks. The school district site is off close to the Manning Ranch border. And so all of these parcels were considered. So we identified 48 acres here. We don't think that we're going to have such a high percentage of redevelopment, but 30% would be necessary. Again, we have assumptions for affordability and proposed density at 45 dwelling units per acre. Now, there are some existing residential designations in this area. They're slated for 18 dwelling units per acre, so this would be a significant increase. And so keep in mind when you're looking at a density like this, you're looking at probably a 4 to 5 story building. Again, applying all these assumptions, we have some unit yields that are there to the right-hand side of the diagram. The Dover Westcliff area. So now the area here we're really focusing in on is between Westcliff along Dover, from 16th Street to Westcliff. And there's a few parcels down closer to Cliff and south of 16th Street as well. So we have 14 acres, a much smaller area than the other two. Projected redevelopment is 40%, and that's based upon some of the small office buildings that are there, and not the church and not the very large office building at Westcliff. And so 40% seemed a reasonable assumption here. Again, we've got affordability assumptions, and we'll come back to that momentarily here when we sum all this up. But the density here was debated and discussed, and 30 dwelling units per acre was decided. So that is not a significant increase over what would otherwise be allowed in this mixed-use zone. Now, the parcels south of 16th along Dover and then the parcel at the northwest corner at Cliff are not designated for housing today, and so they would be included in this possible rezone strategy. So we have some unit yields here, much smaller compared to the rest, but they do help the total. Moving up, Newport Center. So we took a look at Newport Center very closely, Corporate Plaza, the tennis club sites, Fashion Island, and other parcels of Newport Center. We did receive some interest in some of these parcels, and that's reflected in the charts. We identified 162 acres, so it's about the same size as the airport area. The percent to redevelopment, 27%, and our assumptions for affordability are a little bit different. 45 dwelling units per acre is what we assumed. And then, of course, we get the unit yields that you see here. The total unit yields here are about the same as the airport area. I want to just take a look at the site plan ordinance. I know you've received some correspondence about the site plan ordinance, and I wanted to kind of go over what that really is. So back in 1971, the city adopted an ordinance that protected the views from the homes that are on the right-hand side of the diagram there. And so this is basically a 32-foot high building envelope over kind of the sloping surface of the ground, if you will, And those elevations, those blue boxes are elevations. But think of it as just a height limit of 32 feet to protect the views from the residential neighborhood east of MacArthur Boulevard. And so that's an ordinance that's still in effect today. It's also embodied in the 3 planned communities that are under that area: Corporate Plaza West, and it's called Newport Village, which is the Corondamar Plaza and the site that we're sitting in here. Moving forward, Coyote Canyon is another focus area. I think the community looked at this very large parcel and decided, well, boy, why can't we put some housing over there? Well, it is a constrained site. Most of the site is a landfill, and building on the landfill is quite challenging and quite expensive. And ultimately, we're looking at just that northerly 22 acres there that's not over the landfill itself. We do have some interest from the County of Orange, as well as Tate and Associates, who has an option to develop a golf course here. So we're working with them to identify some housing opportunities here.
And if I may, real quick, we did receive a letter late today from both the state and federal Fish and Wildlife. They're asking the council to remove the housing units off the Coyote Canyon. I think from a staff standpoint, we just like to study that, take some time to study that letter and kind of reach out to people to understand what their thinking was.
One point I might want to add for clarification: there is a process to amend the Natural Communities Conservation Plan. So it's possible that through an amendment process, we could still create this as a housing opportunity. But it's going to take a little more study. And as Simone indicated, we're going to study that. But we do think it's still a viable site today. We are looking at, as I said, 22 acres here at the northern corner. We're looking at 100% projected to redevelopment and 35% for low or very low. And so you can see the unit yields over there, 880 total, with a significant number of low-income units. Banning Ranch is still on our radar. The general plan, if it's not developed as open space or for conservation purposes, has an option for housing development of up to 1,375 units. And so we're utilizing that. It's in our current housing element today, and we do feel that there is some potential here. Obviously, it's a complicated site. It went through a review process and was denied by the Coastal Commission, but we do believe that there may be a way to develop a portion of the site for housing and affordable housing. And so we want to keep this one for discussion purposes. Again, 1,375 units is consistent with our current land use element for that optional development option. Okay, so there's some Banning Ranch is challenging, as I noted. What we need to do is we need to rezone this site. We need to get Coastal Commission approval and annexation. So will that take? Can we do that in 3 years? And that 3 years is important. And what you'll notice in section 4 of the document, all of these rezone strategies, all of these focus areas that I've been touching upon, we're basically having a policy statement that we will go in and rezone these areas to provide these unit yields. And we have to do that within the first 3 years of the planning cycle. And so this housing element is good for the next 8 years, starting in October. And within the first 3 years, we have to go in and identify all of these sites and actually go in and do some form of rezoning, some form of overlay, some form of zoning strategy that permits the housing units, the number of housing units that you see in the tables. So with this area, it is a little challenging. So we do have to kind of reconcile the differences between the Coastal Commission and state HCD.
Mr. Mayor, quick question on that. When you say we must, is there a statute or a code that says that, or is that something that has come from conversations with HCD?
It is in the statute. So basically, if we're going to establish a rezone program to identify housing opportunities that we don't have today, we have 3 years within which to implement that program. And that's why you see in the various action statements in Section 4 that all of them have a timeline of 36 months.
So on this Banning Ranch, how were we able to, no one on this council was on the council then, but how was this council able to approve housing on the property without going through all of this all at once? Because it just strikes me that the zoning is already there. LAFCO doesn't, LAFCO is it's within our sphere of influence. We would be able to annex it in once if a project actually got built. and then we'd be going through coastal commission before we'd be able to go through annexation. So that, all of this was, we basically did this already, but didn't actually get the LCP approval, and therefore didn't go through annexation. So how would we be able to accomplish what is stated here when we were able to essentially do this already as a council?
Yeah, it's a tall order, definitely. So with the prior approval by the city, that entire process was rescinded. So we really don't have any zoning at all for the Banning Ranch area. We do have a general plan. As I indicated, it has dual usage, conservation and housing. So that's in place, but we would need to go through a rezone, if you will, in advance of annexation. We would need to get the zoning, if you will, approved by coastal. And yes, that is a tall order within 3 years.
And then we'd have to annex in land not knowing what it would be?
Well, the process for annexation typically requires, well, in fact, always requires that we provide the zoning. We pre-zone the site so that on day one, when it is annexed, we have the rules in place for what it can be, and so that the property owners have knowledge of what their rights are under our zoning process. And so we would need to go through that process. Now, one thing that's different, we do have Banning Ranch on our housing element today. Now, the rules under which the current housing element, the fifth cycle housing element, were done are much different than they are today. And so this is a site that was in our existing housing element, and we want to continue to use it in our upcoming housing elements, why it's proposed. And so in order to do that, we have to go through and make good on those promises to ensure that the housing opportunity is available within 3 years. And as I noted, it's a pretty tall order.
Seems to me that the state is telling us to find a housing opportunity, and then the state is saying, pushing us through some pretty high hurdles to create that housing opportunity. Well, that's what we've learned over the last year. All right.
Yes. All right, moving forward, accessory dwelling units. I know that's been a discussion. I know you've got some correspondence about what those assumptions would be. In our document here, the basic methodology is to take our most recent production and multiply it times 8. We have an 8-year planning cycle. And so our unit yield, based on what the state is suggesting, is about 170 units. In the draft document, based on your direction to be a bit more aggressive and input from the community, as well as the Housing Element Update Committee, we have an aggressive approach. We've basically doubled it. And we've got policies in the document that should support enhanced production of ADUs over the next 8 years. And so, we hope that works. It does provide opportunities for housing and affordable housing, in built-out communities within the coastal zone and outside the coastal zone. And that kind of helps out and brings additional housing in other areas of the community that you haven't seen tonight. So, you've seen those focus areas where we're looking at projects coming forward, but these ADUs are an opportunity to put housing opportunities if the property owner is wanting to build these things and put them into established neighborhoods, which provide additional opportunities, and some of those would be affordable. And so it does create a better distribution. Moving on, so our current assumption right now is 334, if I add that correctly. And so we feel that's double what the safe harbor approach is. And what I mean by safe harbor is we've had discussions with HCD and SCAG, and we're well above with our current assumption here of 334 units. We're double where the state thinks we should be on this. We do feel we've got policies in our document that will help support this, because as you know, we just haven't had much production on ADUs, and that's what the safe harbor approach is based upon. But I think as the community understands what they are, that we can enhance production.
Ms. Dixon.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I've always been curious as we've built our multiplier based on a very low level of current ADU, but we haven't, the laws are 3 years old. We haven't been promoting them. Tonight, later on the agenda, we're going to be considering an item to waive the permit fees. So we really haven't been in an acceleration mode for ADUs. So I wonder if this estimate is too conservative.
And that's the feedback we'd like from the council this evening. It's just, your input is really important for us this evening.
Because we really haven't experienced a big, strong push.
That's correct.
And,
Absolutely.
Yeah, a lot of people don't even understand it. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to try to summarize all those prior slides. And so we've got our arena allocation. This is similar to the slide that you saw before. And we've got the accessory dwelling units row there, the projects in the pipeline, the fifth cycle sites are there. We get credit for those. So the rezone strategies, which are the subject of those focus areas, we've totaled all those up, and those are the sum totals of all the areas that you saw, those individual slides there. And so what we've got here is we've met our RENA goals to provide housing opportunities for very low and low income, moderate income, and above moderate income. And it's important to note in that yellow box there, you see that above moderate income, that's a big number. And the real need for that is that that's what's going to pay for all the affordable units in town. That's typically how these projects or mixed income projects are financed. It's really on the backs of that market rate project that helps subsidize the lower income units. You see a surplus there. We call it a buffer. And we're hoping that we need some feedback from the council on this, but HCD, State Department of Housing and Community Development, is recommending that we provide a buffer. And it's important to understand why the buffer is there. And I'm going to get into that momentarily. The buffer. So,
Ms. Dixon.
Okay, so the new number, or at least I had not seen it before that you presented earlier, that the pipeline total is 2630. Is that number correct, that we currently have in the pipeline? And if I understood you correctly,
it's 2682. It's a combination of fifth cycle sites and pipeline.
well, even better. Okay, 2682. And that is validated as permissible from HCD?
Yes.
Okay, so on your current slide, why aren't we factoring in 4845 minus 2682?
Well, we are. So those numbers there, the 130, the 348, and the 2204, those are basically projects that we've planned for, and they're subtracting from the RENA allocation above. The same is happening with the accessory dwelling units. And so what that's doing is that it's reducing the overall unit yield so that our rezone strategies are smaller than what would be required.
What is that number? It's not 40, so all these many weeks, we've all been talking about we've got to reach 4845, and now we hear it's 4845 less 2682, which is great. I'm thrilled to hear that if I'm understanding it correctly. Is that a correct assumption?
No, so the way it works is when you start plugging in those allocations with that percentage redevelopment, percentage affordability, you need that above moderate to pay for that very
Right.
low and low. So no matter how we do it, this above moderate always gets boosted up because they all worked in
So these are
together.
mainly above moderate.
That's correct. And it's all tied together, unfortunately.
Okay, I see that. Well, then to the next point about the 9889, now that you've put this in a presentation, I would not like it to be cast in concrete for the city of Newport Beach with HCD saying, oh, Newport Beach, you can potentially, you've identified 9,800 sites, so go at it, go do it. So I'm concerned that if you, Jim, your words were recommends a buffer, and you'll get into this in a moment, is it mandated?
A buffer?
Yes.
It's highly recommended that we have a buffer, especially in the low and very low and moderate income. The above moderate income is something that we really don't need to plan for. We've got plenty of units in the
Right.
pipeline to accommodate that. But no, a buffer is not mandated. We don't have to have a buffer, but I'll explain why we're recommending that we have a small buffer.
Okay, but we've had many years, if we find that these sites we've in my opinion, if we've identified these sites and they're not panning out, then we go to our own backup list or wait list of identify. I'm just reluctant to put that number out there. Also, I just want to amplify your point, because this was important learning going through all these weeks, how important the above moderate or the moderate and above, because when you have development companies that are going to be building the low income affordable, there are certain tax credits, federal and state tax credits, and financing abilities that are paid for via the moderate. So I think it's an important message to the community that we're not talking about we need housing, we need affordable housing, we need low income housing, obviously, but we're still going to be building market rate housing because market rate helps pay for the low income, and it's a necessary combination. So, okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, moving forward on the buffer. A couple things kind of factor in this decision. We've got a no net loss provision of Senate Bill 166. So we must provide sites to meet the RENA and then the unaccommodated or unplanned need during the planning period. So what's transpiring is that a project comes in and we are actually considering a project that includes 20% of the units as being affordable. And if we've assumed a higher percentage, the difference between our assumption in this document and what a future project might be, that's where the buffer comes from, and that's where the need is. I can show you how that works here momentarily. So if we've planned for a project in this housing sites list, which is in the appendix, Appendix B, you'll see a table there with every site noted. So if we plan for 150 units and a developer comes in and they're building 200 units, but only 20% or 40 units of those 200 are actually for low or affordable. So we've got a difference between our planned 150 and the proposed 40. So where does the 110 units come from? If we have no buffer, then we have to go find, as a community, another site somewhere and rezone it within 180 days. And that's a challenging thing to do. So if we have a buffer, then we can review and we can approve this project. We couldn't deny it if it didn't meet our planning expectations. That's important to note. So if it comes in as described here in this chart, we couldn't say no to the project. But we'd have to make sure we have that unit yield 110 units. And that's why the buffer is so important, is to avoid a scenario where we don't have a buffer and we approve a project and we have to go find another site within 180 days. So that's where that number comes in, very low and low. So we have 476 that we're anticipating, very low, and 227 in the low. So it's about 20%. And so that's within the range that HCD does recommend. So that 110 unit shortfall in the project that you just saw would come out of that surplus right there. Now, when that surplus gets to zero and that next project comes in, that's when we'd have to go out and find out another site to accommodate it. So,
Mr. Muldoon?
Thank you. Yeah, so I just want to dive into that a little bit. So the point is to have these planned, not necessarily built, correct?
we need to plan for them. We have to show that we have these sites and provide the zoning for these sites, but there's no obligation to build them, and that would be up to the private sector.
That's right. So if we were to plan with no obligation to build, assuming the private sector meets it or not, I don't understand why we would plan for more. It's starting to feel like Animal House when they're on double secret probation. I feel like we're kind of, okay, we're in trouble. Oh, we're in double trouble. We better put a surplus in. I don't see, and I'm afraid, like Councilwoman Dixon pointed out, that state's going to say, okay, great, they've got even more room than we thought. Maybe we underestimated Newport. So I personally don't think I like the buffer idea.
Okay. So when we're out of those buffer units, as I said, we have to rezone within 180 days to find those. Another question that we're fielding a fair amount of is, will Charter Section 423 apply to those rezones for more units? Well, it may, depending upon the number of units. And so, we can envision a period of time in the future where we have to go find additional site, and you could have a vote of the electorate come. And will we be able to comply with 180 days? So that might be very, very challenging. So hence why staff is recommending that we have a small buffer.
Can I
Ms.
just,
Dixon?
just to follow up to that, clarify then the green light. For the overall, the original 4,900, 4,985, is any part of that subject to green light?
We do anticipate that it is, because right now with the housing element, we're actually not providing those rezone strategies, if you will. We're just establishing a policy that we will go and do that within the next 3 years. And so when we go in and do those rezone strategies, we'll be amending the general plan and then providing the zoning consistent with the policy framework that you see here in the draft document, and that's when a vote of the electorate would be required.
Okay,
Now,
all right. Thank you.
That answers your question. Okay, good. So again, I've been stressing why no net loss is important. So the state law requires that we have opportunities to meet the RENA and the RENA as it goes forward over time. As we build projects that actually satisfy or fall within these income categories, that means we don't need to produce more in the future, okay? And so we always have to have an accommodation of whatever that remaining unaccommodated need is over time throughout the entire planning cycle. And so that's what the law requires us to do, and hence why the buffer is quite important in our opinion.
Mr. O'Neill.
Yeah, real quick, I do have a lot to say, and I'm going to hold off and wait until the end, and probably actually after public comments. But real quick, on that question of the buffer, it's probably worth noting the reason that staff is bringing this up is, in particular, it's because of the discussion about green light. So if we end up in a situation where, so we would be able to adopt a housing element, and then eventually down the road, we'd need to accomplish a land use element. Once you have the land use element change, it would almost certainly require a green light vote. It's also possible in those 3 years between adoption of a housing element and a green light, in the land use element, that we would be in a situation where you could actually have a number of required green light votes, because you could create, and I'm sure you'll talk about this, but you could create overlay zones. And the overlay zones don't change the land use element or the general plan. So you could approve something that matches our overlay zone in order to stimulate housing production, but then when we go to change the general plan on the land use element, it could trigger green light. And so we'd have individual green light votes on various projects. And what I think what staff's saying is, if those go to vote and fail, you have a no net loss issue at that point, and that's what they're talking about on the buffer. You'll hear me say later, I'm not going to recommend on the draft that we send to HCD the 20% buffer, but I think it's probably worth noting that that's the basic idea of what we've been talking about here, is that the cities that have a slow growth ordinance or a slow growth charter amendment, they do the recommendations on are a little higher for those kinds of cities, because of the expectation that occasionally votes would fail. In this city, probably more than occasionally, but I think it's worth noting that that's the thought process behind this when we're working through this, because this is not easy by any stretch of the imagination. I just want to make sure it's, at least there's a little bit more background on the thought process that's been discussed at the housing element update.
Ms. Brenner.
I was interested in your next slide there, where you're talking about how other cities have handled the buffer question, and especially Encinitas, because they've got this lawsuit ongoing about their green light type initiative, and yet they're choosing the majority of their plan to be a buffer. So, and the range is so great there of how cities are handling this buffer issue.
So what we can do, Councilmember Brenner, is our consultant that's actually working on the Encinitas housing element, he could probably speak to it if you'd like.
You want to do that now or later, whenever is good for you.
David, why don't you go up and just address Encinitas and what the challenge that they've kind of had, and why is that 62% versus 20 or 0?
Yeah. The issue with Encinitas, there's a level of, as you know, there's ongoing litigation related to that, and so as part of the process, there's 3 lawsuits, and it's very complicated. We won't get into it during this time, but the issue with that is more of a quid pro quo type of an arrangement, where they wanted to be aggressive on other things such as ADUs, among other things. So the trade-off of that, if you will, was to provide a higher buffer. So there was a speculative kind of approach to a lot of the sites, and so they balanced that with HED with the negotiations to have that higher number.
So that was actually negotiated, the 62%.
And it's still under negotiation.
Ms. Dixon?
Quick question on the buffer. So just looking at this chart, these range of percentages, but if I am reading our chart, I don't know what page it is that you just went through on the summary of sites.
Ours is 20 and 22%, about
Okay.
20%.
But overall, it's 104%?
No, the above moderate. We'll go back to that slide there.
All right, so the buffer, but overall, well, all right, so
No,
above moderate.
She's right.
Okay, yeah, I see that now. I see the 104%. That's
Yeah.
correct.
So when we're looking at these other cities, what's apples to apples?
David, I'll need David as a consultant on the buffer, the overall total. Ours is 104. What's Encinitas, you think? Yes. For the total, where ours is 104%, what is Encinitas, you think? I don't know. I'd have to. We'll get back to. We'll
All
look
right,
that up.
okay, I was just going to say, to follow up on Councilmember Brenner's comment, first of all, other cities are considering, well, if Newport Beach were on this list, they'd see that Newport Beach is considering 104%. I mean, no one's at the final decision, and they're probably far from it. So I just want to caution us all to not be rushing to judgment on what other cities are doing, because I think I think from what I understand, we're far ahead of many cities in terms of our work on this. I have another question back to Greenlight, just to clarify. So as we move forward and we've identified these properties that once they go through the projected development process, could we see individual properties that have been identified for development would have to go through, I mean, at some point, green light's going to be triggered on many of them. So we're going to be going through this green light amendment process?
It's definitely possible. And, if they're not going to wait for our update to the land use element, and if they want to move forward, it'll be up to them to say, yes, I want to move forward. And because of the high housing numbers that they have to plan for or get entitlements for, it could trigger a green light.
Well, so there's been no adjudication or ruling or regulation that says that local no-growth ordinances are invalidated by this process?
There's no case law at this point.
Are there any pending lawsuits? Do you know?
I'm not aware, besides,
Well, this is going to be a huge issue for us.
whatever Encinitas going forward with. I don't know of anything right now.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Will do.
I got to keep going with this Animal House analogy. So it feels like the dean doesn't want us to get these RENA numbers, or we're restricted, if you will, by our own green light, which is a slow growth initiative, not a no growth initiative, correct?
Correct.
So Lambda is going to lose its charter if we don't find a way to get the residents to agree to the units that we don't even want to propose. And if they come to us in a free market fashion, we then have to sell back to the residents over our restriction upon ourselves, which is the green light, essentially.
That's correct.
So it's like it's unbelievable, actually. Is green light even enforceable? And I mean, I've heard people say that with these new mandates, the low control that's going to be litigated is taken away not only from us in the dais, but from the residents who pass initiatives like this.
I think there's still to come. I think all that is still to come, where the state's going to try to kind of subvert our own charter. I think a lot of that is still pending. Right now, our charter is in place, and we have to comply with our charter. But I think going forward, there's going to be a lot of changes we see coming from the state.
So we can use the charter then to keep our numbers lower, which is what I prefer, rather than using our charter with a buffer and setting a precedent or working with the state to basically take away our rights. Does that make sense?
It does, and that's just the feedback we're looking for from the council.
Yeah, so I would revert back again to Councilman Dixon's statements. I don't know why we want to show them
More.
Exactly.
Right.
Especially when we can use green light to preserve a low control. And also, I don't want to lead on this issue. I think some other cities can go through the headache. If they have a no-growth initiative, which is tougher than a slow-growth initiative, they can go through the headache of having it litigated, and we can see how it goes and save that money. That's how I personally feel. Thank you.
Mr. Blom.
Thank you. I just wanted clarification real quick on the numbers for numbers, Simone. When we're looking at that original slide that shows Encinitas at 67%, is that comparable to our 102%, or what was it, 110% for us? Or is that comparable to our 20%?
That's
and
comparable to
22%?
22%.
Thank you. I think that's an important clarification to make, because we can build above market homes. I think that buffer at 102% is important for us to realize. We're good at building above market homes here. It's never been our issue. It's the 20 and 22% I think we have to adjust that focus to. So, and I agree with both Dixon and Muldoon about that. We don't want to overestimate what this buffer is. We want to keep it as negligible as possible, but I just want to make sure we're talking about the same numbers here, that we're at about 22%. Is that correct, Simone? Encinitas is running 67, so that 110%, 102% is related to our entire overgrowth model. Thank you.
That's correct.
Mr. O'Neill.
Yeah, that was my question too. I wanted to make sure I was understanding the apples to apples. Also, I just want to point out real quick, Encinitas litigation is really complicated, what's going on down there. And so I'm not even going to try to claim that that's apples to apples either, but I will note that in one of the pieces of litigation, the judge had set aside their slow growth initiative in order to allow them to certify a housing element. And they're currently in litigation where they are submitting on trial briefs as we speak. They're submitting trial briefs trying to decide whether this, in order to get to a compliant housing, keep their compliant housing element status, Encinitas had to file a lawsuit to determine the status of whether the state laws override their slow growth initiative. So they almost essentially had to sue their own residents to try to determine whether it's valid. So that is ongoing litigation. So I'm just going to say, I've read those trial briefs. It really is complicated what's going on down there. But I do want to point out that there was separate litigation where the Building Industry Association was suing Encinitas, and sorry, there was another group, and I'm just forgetting the name of it. But they've claimed that they've spent over $2.4 million on litigation so far as a city over this issue. So it's no joke what's going on down there. There's no binding precedent. There's no case law. There may end up being case law out of the current trial that they're going through, but I just point out that it's a mess down there. And so, anyway, I appreciate the clarification on that, because I was trying to understand the 104 versus 20 also. Thanks.
Ms. Dixon.
Just one quick question. We do have our city attorney sitting here. Would you like to opine on what we're talking about regarding our city and green light and how you would recommend? I mean, I'm not going to hold you to it, but just help us think through the process as we're calculating all these different aspects.
Well, I think the most important issue is whether you can go forward with the housing element or you have to go to a green light vote on the housing element. And it's our opinion that you can go forward with the housing element piece of it without going to a green light vote. I do think that there's, a lot of issues up in the air about whether or not the state laws supersede kind of these local charter amendments. And, like Councilmember O'Neill pointed out, those are being litigated. So it's hard to know what ultimately is going to come of that, but that's sort of where we sit today.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, just one quick note. I think we absolutely need to move forward assuming it's valid. I don't want anyone thinking that I'm saying otherwise. I think we need to be moving forward assuming that the laws in our charter and on our books are all valid. So I do want to point that out. I'm not for a second saying otherwise. So it's just a mess that is what's going on in another city in a different county. But I'm pointing out that's.
And I wasn't trying to imply that green light wasn't valid. I'm just saying that these are issues that are currently being litigated. And so I didn't mean to put words in your mouth.
No, I didn't think so. But I just wanted to be really clear that there's no case law saying otherwise. There's no statute saying otherwise. It is being litigated, but not by us.
Excuse me. I'll go ahead and continue. We each have a few more slides here to go through. So as I kind of touched upon earlier in the presentation, those focus areas, we've got policy actions here that would require the city to go through and rezone or do overlays or specific plans or some form of zoning to provide these housing opportunities within 3 years, and 3 years is mandatory. There's a policy in here that talks to adopting a minimum affordable housing policy within 6 months to do something fairly quickly. But then we would actually follow up within 2 years to do a more comprehensive citywide inclusionary ordinance that might look at the nuances of the different villages and establish different percentages for different areas. So there are policies related to that. ADUs analyze incentives to increase production within the first 12 months. tonight on your agenda, we already got one of those incentives is to waive the fees for ADUs to see if we can spur construction. If we can get some interest here this summer, we'll use that as we discuss our ADU policies with HCD. So that's also in the policy document. We are going to be accommodating and supporting special needs populations, seniors, persons with disabilities. There's policies related to that, supportive services, funding for assistance in future affordable housing. If we do have that inclusionary ordinance, we do anticipate smaller projects might pay into an in lieu fee, and we would take those funds and leverage other funds to help support other projects. And so that's also a policy here to establish an affordable housing fund. Affirmatively furthering fair housing, and so that is definitely a section in the document that you should take a look at. We're analyzing and identifying different barriers to entry. Obviously, we are going to continue to fund our fair housing services to ensure that we don't have any discrimination in the community and help educate property owners in anti-discrimination, if you will. We obviously want to have specific actions to foster a more inclusive community. Next steps, so we're looking for public comments on the draft through April 30th, and so all the comments that the Planning Commission, the committee, the public, yourself, all of this is informing what goes into the eventual draft. So we'll be doing some additional edits and amendments to the policy program consideration, the sites analysis, statutory compliance verification, additional public stakeholder comments. So any comments we hear tonight, we'll obviously be factoring those in as well. And so our intent is to prepare a draft for HCD's submittal. And what the state law requires is a 60-day review period of a draft. And that way we can get feedback from state HCD before we adopt the housing element. That's an important step in the process. So we want to get those comments, and then that will influence what the final document will look like. So our plan is to bring that forward, and our intent was to submit this in May after we hear all this feedback. I also want to touch base that we are going to be doing an environmental impact report for the project. We're beginning that process now. We are going to be looking at a traffic study, infrastructure analysis, and services analysis so that we can understand what the impacts of these decisions are on the community. How are we going to finance this? All these questions start to get raised. And so we're going to be doing an environmental impact report. So we'll have that for the council before adoption of the final document so that you can understand the ramifications. So we're looking to prepare that this summer, have a 45-day public review period here. It's all building towards certification and adoption by the deadline, which is in October, mid-October specifically, of 2021. So the statutory deadline is October 15th, 2021. There is no penalty if we do not turn it in on time. 120 days is our leeway. On the 121st day, the statute basically requires that we go in and prepare 2 4-year housing elements. Those are concurrent, so we'd have to do this twice, every 4 years, rather than 8 years. So we'd get to do this all over again. So it also exposes the city to a variety of fines. We did have that in the presentation. I did not summarize it, but there are a variety of techniques the state can use. They can obviously file litigation. They have a new enforcement wing that's been funded to make sure that the cities are doing what's required by the law. And so they could also decertify our housing element. They could fine us. They could, in essence, take funds, and it's pretty dire at that point. But obviously, we like to avoid that. So our plan would be to turn it in on October 15th, if not within 120 days of October 15th. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Simone.
And this is our final slide, so I'll just wrap it up. And thank you, Jim. Good presentation. What we want to show here is that there's still a lot of work ahead of us. Right now we're just talking about that housing element, and we'll be before you on talking about that circulation element. But you've heard from the community about the zoning, the overlays, the design standards, the massing. How do we master plan our communities going forward? And all that's to come in the next 3 years. And the part of the policies, the action plan, is to get everything else done. We still want to focus on our general plan update, and you could see there that we want to pivot after this housing element and start focusing on all the other elements. concurrently working on our land use element and start talking about what is these parts of the community, these villages, going to start to look like. And all that is going to be part of the community input process. And we really have 3 years to get everything done. So huge amount of work ahead of us. And I know it's kind of exhausting that we've just been 2 years through this, but we still got another 3 years going forward. And Mr. Mayor, if it's okay, I want to hand it over to Chair Larry Tucker from our Housing Committee to say a few words. At the end, what staff is looking for is just your input, your thoughts, thoughts on timing, thoughts on ADUs, our allocations, our densities. All that is really important to us as we finalize our housing element. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Larry Tucker, Chairman of the Housing Element Committee. I was on the Planning Commission for 11 years in the city. I had 2 housing elements that I went through, and I scoured those documents looking for something that I could at least ask a question about to make it seem like maybe I'd read the document. They were perfunctory at the policy-making level. They were really kind of aspirational documents, and they didn't generate enough housing, especially in some jurisdictions where if people put up a fight about it, projects got disapproved. States kind of changed the rules, and in my opinion, they've overreacted. They've come up with something that I thought initially I just wasn't reading carefully enough, and that ultimately over the course of a few months I would understand how the statutory framework fit together, and I've never gotten there. And I don't believe I will get there, and I believe the more that the council understands, the more questions that you will have about the process and how this works. So it's my personal opinion that we'll get a housing element approved, and then over the course of the 3 or 4 years that we're going to be working on it, and other jurisdictions we'll finally find out how it works. The thing that's kind of terrifying is it might not work that way. We may end up with a lot more housing than this community is really set up for. Keep in mind that we have a built-out community. Most of our parcels are being used. They're not junky uses. Most of that stuff you've already seen has come through out in the airport area. All the obsolete development is being replaced by new development. Most of what remains is not obsolete. So that means the state has decided that our balanced land use plan is not their preferred land use. Every property that's taken out of its existing use is a decision by the state that that's not the best use for the property. So we're going to end up with a housing imbalance. So it's a very frustrating process that we've all gone through. So with the committee, I was charged with, the whole committee was, with coming up with a plan to comply with our RENA. And we had hoped in earlier meetings that there would be different approaches that we could take. We could gather together with other agencies. We could convince the state. We could sponsor the legislation. But if all of that failed, then we would have to have a plan to comply, and that's kind of still where we are. I think things will change. It just won't change by the time that the housing element needs to be adopted. So the housing element is probably the least specific document of all the documents that you see up there on the list. And it just generally says, where are we going to put housing? So we spent a lot of time looking at every site, every potential site in town to see which ones could work for housing. But as Simone mentioned, that really is just the start of the story. Because as it turns out, as we went through the entire town to look at what was feasible, we actually wrote letters to all those owners to see, well, who's interested in doing housing. I would think that I might be overstating it a bit to say it was a tepid response. We didn't really have a lot of property owners that came back. Because of all the questions that you folks have, it has a chilling effect to hear that half the units are supposed to be affordable. I mean, property owners are paying attention. And it's I don't really think it's going to work that way. But it leaves them with less than an enthusiastic position. If you were a property owner, your view would be, If it's a better deal for me, a noticeably better deal for me, and I have to do some affordable housing, but it's still a better deal, I'll do it. But if it's not a better deal, or if it's kind of too close to tell, or it's not hardly worth the effort, then I'm not going to do it. And that's not going to change because it's all private property. We don't have a lot of public property that's available for housing. So I think what the what the game plan has been is, well, let's go forward with the housing element, get the housing element approved, and then we'll really start into the details of how the mechanics of all this is going to work with our overlays. And the reason why I say that we're going to be finding out what the details are with our overlays is that we don't have specific properties that we can rezone, or not very many of them, so most of them are going to be overlays, like the example that came up earlier on Newport Center. We've got 160 acres. We're going to assume that if we put an overlay over all of that, that 25% of it's going to convert, and then they're going to do housing, and a certain amount of it's going to be affordable. It's an assumption upon assumption at this point as to how broad the overlay has to be, but we have to get into the actual specifics as to how the mechanics are going to work, and that is going to take a lot of time. I mean, it's going to be a deeper conversation than you can imagine, and because it's so policy-based, I'm sorry, the council is going to be heavily involved in this. It's going to take up a lot of your time over the next couple of years, because you're going to be concerned about, one of the things that and this is ironic the way it is, we had originally said we would like a categorical exemption. We suggest that for CEQA to do housing. The state said, no, of course not. We're not going to do that. CEQA is very important. They've now got everything set up to convert to objective standards. That's a word of art. Objective standards mean you don't have a discretionary approval, which means CEQA doesn't apply. So they're getting around the application of CEQA by objective standards, which means we're going to have some interest in establishing objective standards. So when somebody comes in with a 60 unit per acre project, that it looks more like Uptown Newport than it does like something that got sprayed on stucco in Irvine. Those are all going to be things that are going to have to work their way through the documentation. So, the real action is yet to come. The housing element is a starting point. It's the least specific document. I can't say that it's all going to work out perfectly, and we certainly have some resident interest in how this is going to work out. And I commend them, by the way, for attempting to understand this stuff and having their own ideas and their own concerns, because we should all really be concerned. But I think that my gut is that the technical things that are to come are going to define a lot better what's going to happen on these properties than the housing element itself, because it's not the land use element and it's not a zoning document. We still have to do those. So with that, I'm here to answer any questions. I'm sure staff will do a better job at it, but if you do want to ask, I'm here. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Muldoon.
Oh, thank you. Thank you to the Housing Element Committee, including Mr. Tucker and other members, and Councilman O'Neill. A lot of work was put into this. And oversight in the council and participation at the volunteer level. I personally think that there's no benefit from us turning in homework early. I think we can wait and see what other cities are doing. I know I've fielded phone calls from other council members in the county, from other cities asking what we're doing, and they're sharing ideas with my colleagues and I as well. I believe that the smartest approach is to get in the last minute. There's no need for us to pass the 15th, although there's no penalty. I love that. It's nothing like college. But if we can get on the 15th, I think that'd be smart. We can wait and see what happens. I personally think that slowing down is going to help us also from a couple reasons. I seek to capture more ADUs. As you know, we discussed prior this permit holiday we're going to be voting on later today. And we up here know that there are many units that aren't being accounted for that we might be able to locate. I'm not sure how we do it exactly, but I think for us to slow the process down, to locate as many ADUs and get them in compliance as possible so they're reflected, to know what other strategies other cities are using, and for us to continue the conversation with the members of the community is going to be the best way, I think, to submit a really good proposal. I do support preserving the site plan that was brought up earlier, and I guess I want to thank you all for your hard work, staff and the committee and council members who are involved. Thank you.
Ms. Dixon.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a few comments, and then obviously we'll have more when it comes back from after public comments. I just want to clarify, if you wouldn't mind, Simone or Jim, going back to the schedule. I think it's really important, at least my belief is, and really to echo what Councilmember Muldoon just said, not to rush this through, in other words. So you've indicated that we need, in the next 60 days, what do we need to do? What is the furthest deadline that we need to go dig deep now after the council gives some direction as to next steps? When is our feedback and all this incorporated with community input? What is that absolute furthest deadline?
We thank you, Councilmember Dixon. So we have, as Mr. Campbell put forward, looks like we have 120-day penalty-free. I do think that, and as I expressed to the city manager, if the council would like us to pause and spend some more time exploring the ADUs and taking on more of your comments, I think for us, we wouldn't want to spend more than 60 days doing the staff work, because we'd still like to circle back with the community, get their input on any revisions that we do make. And I would think circle back to the city council to get kind of that final look with the revised, updated document. And so that's going to take time, and then submit that to HCD to get their 60-day review going. So I wouldn't want to spend more than 60 days on the staff side to do any additional work.
All right, so building from 60 days on the staff side, the clock starting tonight, essentially, and then it comes back to council?
I would like to get maybe some community input on the work that we've done, get their input.
So that's another couple weeks?
Probably just another week, and then we'd schedule within 2 weeks to 3 weeks with the city council.
So we're probably talking 90 days
at most
to kind of get this start to finish. Well, I support that.
Okay.
I totally agree with Councilmember Muldoon. We're not looking for the gold star here to get in the fastest, and I think we've got it all understood, just as Mr. Tucker said, that there's a lot of unknowns here.
Right.
And I just want to say before we continue, but of course we want to thank the Housing Element Update Advisory Committee, and thanks to Chairman Tucker. This has been incredible work, and Councilmember O'Neill and all the community. I mean, we've gotten so many letters. People, I think at the beginning, I remember, because that was during the period where we started the general plan update process before we diverted over to the housing element. People were trying to ramp up community understanding and interest, and I think clearly that is continuing to happen and now accelerate. Many members of the community are clearly engaged, just given your numbers. One aspect concerns me, that we're doing this in a silo absent the general plan update. So I'm glad to see your schedule. I thought, though, Mr. Jurgis, we were going to start the land use element later this year. I thought we talked about this. And you've changed your thought process?
No. I think we could still definitely start that, and I think we will have to start that conversation. But by the time, and we'll talk more about whether forming another committee and going through that process. And
so you see, probably was reading it wrong. So you think in October 2021, this October?
That's correct.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right. But I would like, and maybe I'll say this at our council meeting, I would like to reformulate or bring back to life that general plan update committee. There may be many members that are still interested in participating. Chair Gardner.
And I think we can definitely have that conversation after we kind of finish off this housing element and get
fine.
feedback from the council.
Basically, I just want to know if we just can take a deep breath here and really absorb what you've been doing. Just a quick question on how the housing element advisory group functioned. Did we, other than enjoying Chair Tucker's enormous knowledge on development and land use, did we bring in other outside consultants?
So we do have Kimberly Horn, who's David Barquist sits behind me. He's our housing element consultant. He's kind of working on putting together the actual document. We have Kearns and West, who is our outreach consultant. And then we have LSA, who's going to do our traffic modeling along with, what's the traffic firm?
Urban Crossroads.
Urban Crossroads. So we have two traffic firms also
Well,
working.
what about the subject matter expert in affordable and low-income housing? Did we bring anyone in?
I did think,
But we had representatives of the committee that
Right.
have some expertise in affordable housing, and so we had some input through the committee process. But we didn't bring in a separate consultant to advise.
Because
the
my
committee.
reason for asking is, my concern actually is an absence of talking to builders. How many affordable housing units have we built in Newport Beach in the last 20 years? Until Shop Off or Jamboree or Uptown Newport, and then Newport Village, 2, and then the Cove, I guess that's conversion. That was
Construction, I can think of 3 projects off the top of my head in the 20 years that I've been with the community, and that's the Bayview Landing Senior Housing Project. That was 100% affordable, 120 units. We've got the senior housing project that the Veterans Project that the community, that you supported. And
Right,
then we've
the
got
Cove,
Uptown Newport,
yeah,
the Cove, and then
yeah.
the Uptown Newport project.
So it's like 3.
So those are the 3, and for the life of me, I can't think of another one.
Okay, and that's the way life is. It's just, I think we have a lot to learn on affordable housing and the financing and the companies that participate in that industry and how we can work together with those companies to do what's, I mean, this is one of my greatest fears is how do we look around the corner and know what the city is going to look like and how it's going to function? We all know that this has many limitations. So I hope that we can be using some outside subject matter experts who can talk to us about how does a city build and encourage and build affordable housing. I don't think we're experts in that, and you're experts in a lot of different areas. I just don't know if we're experts in affordable housing.
and you're correct. We're not experts in everything. And we did invite Michael Costa, and he's here in the audience, so you'll be able to get it. We'll have to encourage him to come up to the microphone for public comments.
Okay, good. All right. Thank you. Well, thank you very much.
Mr. Blum.
Thank you, Mayor. So, excuse me, the Banning Ranch, and we had touched upon this briefly, but can we walk back to that? So we had said that HCD wants approval prior. I'm trying to understand this process better because I look at one of the greatest assets our community has, and an ability to put something where we can grow it now. And I don't want to say that if HCD and the Coastal Commission are duking it out to decide on this process for us that that's a negative or a positive, but I think at one point, what are the barriers for entry here? I guess is my question to you guys. What's stopping us from dropping more in Banning Ranch now, especially in the lower income side? Is it strictly something that HCD is putting in front of us, or is it a decision from us due to the implications of them?
Certainly. It really is a decision. It's our decision. We've identified 1,375 units because that's what our current general plan states. The barriers to entry are for us are really, we have to go through this rezone. We don't have zoning for all of Banning Ranch. We have a very old and antiquated planned community on part of Banning Ranch that's in the city currently. It's about 400 units. But the 1375, we would have to provide by right zoning. We'd have to control the permit process. So we have to annex it and take land use control. So we have to have all of that in place prior to, within 3 years. And that does involve going to the Coastal Commission to having that zoning reviewed as a local coastal program amendment. And that process can take some time. Obviously there are some environmental resources there. We recognize that, and trying to find that right balance there. The state is telling us that there's an affordable housing crisis. We need to find sites. So we think we have a site here. Will all of it fit? Given how the Coastal Commission views it, we don't know. They obviously look at those resources a little bit differently, and we protect those resources as well. But where is that balance point? We have to reconcile that, as the slide says. Could we put more there? Yes, we could. It might actually be denser projects, bigger buildings, if you will, on smaller footprints to avoid the environmental resources. that could be what we're thinking. So all of that has to be factored in our thinking.
Right. I mean, from my perspective, that's definitely something I'd like to look at. If we can start directing a higher growth, higher density area over in Banning Ranch where we can look at what we're going to develop it as later. And yeah, this might be a fight with the Coastal Commission, but if it's an HCD versus Coastal Commission pitch that we're against, I think we have more leverage than we're currently holding over it. We just want to redevelop some land. And so, you know, I really like adjusting focus to that area. You know, I understand, and I thank the Housing Committee. Chair Tucker, you've done an amazing job. It's been a brutal task. And as I look toward the airport district, I see, I see something that I get nervous about what we're doing there. I get nervous that we're trying to dump too much into the airport district. And the airport district has potential in this city. I think that we don't fully comprehend that, it is truly an uptown of Newport. I mean, we can get higher buildings there. We can get more density there. But I worry about dropping too much affordable housing in that area as it starts taking away from our general growth plan over in that area. It could be built more towards a different segment of our grouping. And so I like the spread out factor. And I just want to caution us on putting too much affordable housing in the airport district. I've lived all over this world, and that's been a great thing, but I also see how we can build certain types of neighborhoods and certain types of districts by focusing solely on those, and that always does frighten me because it changes the demographic and the ideal of those areas. And I think sometimes a more sporadic approach, and I always like to caution us that we keep using these terms low income, very low income. For me in the private sector, my servers are probably low income and very low income. And having college students that are living on the peninsula, living throughout Newport Center, living in the airport district that are low income and very low income is not something we have a negative appeal for in Newport Beach. We actually like it. It's wonderful for our city. And so I think sometimes the idea of what we're talking about gets convoluted. And I want to make sure that we're not talking about building barrios. It's not happening. We love our city. We want to protect it. But there is a point where we want college students to be able to come back. I mean, I always tell my son there's not a chance in hell he'll be able to live in Newport unless he gets better grades. And I mean, that's just a reality in this world. It's expensive and hard to live here. And so as we focus on these very specific units, sometimes I want us to remember that they are college flats. They aren't always what we anticipate them being. And so that brings me to the last point of what I want to talk about is the unidentified sites that were created due to 2020. And I think we started this process before. We never knew what this last year would bring. I mean, I think Newport Center is probably the best example of that we had a very dense office population prior to this. Well, we don't have that anymore. And we feel like a lot of this office isn't going to come back. I think a lot of these landlords are looking towards what can we do to regain these revenue sources. And I think that's happening all around the city. I think it's happening in areas where we had office above and retail below, and now they're thinking, hey, can we drop some residents above, some retail below? And I think that those types of things, we want to avoid spot zoning in the city, but identifying kind of our villages and where we can grow them and pulling it away from our residents and where we don't want to build them is part of the continuing process of building our city. And, with what's happening in Balboa Village and kind of that overlay district, I think there's possibilities down there that we maybe haven't thought of before, because I know a lot of people want to live there. And I think when we start putting residents above some retail, it becomes a charming village. It doesn't take away from what the city is. And we have some of these unidentified properties because we have been so focused on our original districts. And so I just want to make sure our staff is looking at what 2020 brought us and some of the retail that has been dying and some of the new opportunities that are progressing, especially with these new overlays. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Mr. O'Neill.
Yeah, I'm gonna run through a bunch of stuff before public comments so that folks can hear my thoughts, and if they'd like to respond, great, because I'm going to talk a bunch of policy here. So I'll echo the initial thoughts, which is thank you to our Housing Element Advisory Update Committee members. We've got a few of them in the audience, and the amount of time that was spent on this, trying to understand what the state goals were and trying to figure out where the assessor's parcel numbers are in our city that could potentially do hold on to this, and then trying to understand the affordable housing side of things, which resulted in a good memo that we've got in our packet. And then also appreciate the folks who are outside the Housing Element Update Committee who have reached out. Staff and to our consultant, I appreciate this too. This is an incredibly difficult job, and so I appreciate all the time, and also our residents who are involved. I'm sure that the residents who are here currently wish there were more residents involved, and so do we. But I do appreciate everyone who's here. I agree that we are clearly ahead of some of our neighbors, which allows for some of the work to be done. So we do have the time, and we do have the ability to do some more work before we submit to HCDs. So since this is a draft, it makes sense to work through with HCD what their guidance is and how it'll apply to a city like Newport Beach, where our geography and our interactions with many state and federal agencies, two of which I hadn't even thought of, send us a letter this afternoon, tend not to be what I would call housing friendly. So I appreciate that we're going to be working on that side of things. And so as we work through, it's also worth noting, and it's to members of the press and to members of our community, the number of units that we had built in our last cycle and the number of policies we've already adopted try to stimulate growth to meet HCD where they are. And look, it shouldn't be lost on anybody that this is clearly and unabashedly state driven. And it probably shouldn't be lost on anyone in this room, and I'm sure it isn't, that tonight we're going to be talking about a project dealing with 35 housing units, and we've been absolutely inundated with emails on that. And currently we're talking about 4,800, and I think we've got about a dozen people in the audience. And so, this is one of those things where I think everyone in the room recognizes how big a deal this is, until it gets next to someone's neighborhood, they're not paying enough attention to it. And so it's on us to make sure that we are. And so here's some of the policy thoughts. So as we look at our draft, it does make sense to start with a more aggressive approach on ADU. I've spoken with folks in the community. I've seen some writing. I agree that we ought to be talking about trying to talk to HCD about 1,000 units of ADU. I also think that, to Mr. Blom's point, we probably should be looking at a higher density on Banning Ranch. Right now, it's listed at 30. I think it's low, frankly, especially if we need to be incorporating it into a small footprint. Frankly, it should probably be up to 50. My thought process basically is it's either going to get built or it's not going to get built. But it's not going to be built because it's at 30 or 50. It's not going to, the issue of whether it's built or not is regulatory and has nothing to do with the density, and we ought to be talking density there. I also think we need to be reducing our buffer, especially in our first draft. I think a realistic buffer for at least a first draft is no more than 5%, not 20, not 22. I think it's probably closer to 5. Part of the thought process there is that as we're working through toward the land use element, if we're finding in the first 3 years or 2 years that the housing element buffer is wrong, then we need to bring it back and talk about it. But it's a heck of a lot easier to change in the first 2 or 3 years on a housing element than it is to try to change the land use element down the road when we're realizing we have to go back to green light. That's my thought process on why a much reduced buffer is appropriate, at least to have the conversations with HCD. Look, I fully expect them to push back, but we at least need to have that dialogue with them now, especially while we're in the draft element. Doing everything that I just described would also reduce some of the figures in Newport Center, in the airport area, in the Coyote Canyon area. I read through that Coyote Canyon area discussion from the U.S. and the state Fish and Wildlife. I think you're right that it's something we can probably work through, but it's probably going to take some time to understand. So, as we're reducing down the numbers in all of these areas in order to increase the ADU and potentially increase some of the density on Banning Ranch, and also reduce the buffer pretty substantially, where I think we're going to see a lot of these numbers coming down in some of the areas that are more what we would call the regional areas as opposed to the APNs. And then I did see one comment about trying to put 100% affordable over in Coyote Canyon. Coyote Canyon is going to be an interesting project to try to even make work, only because of the access issues. In order to make that work from an access issue, you just kind of have to look back at the map, but you'll see that it's up in the corner. And I don't know if they're going to try to connect into Newport Coast Drive, or they're going to try to connect through the neighborhoods. But in order to do any of that stuff, it's going to be pretty substantial infrastructure work, and 100% affordable is not going to be able to afford the substantial infrastructure work that goes along with that, whether it's a senior living facility or whether it's a homeless area. I would also caution, just as a matter of optics, 100% affordable next to what used to be a dump is probably not a great optic either. And I think it's probably it's worth mentioning that. So we're probably going to see a reduction, certainly on the percentage side of Coyote Canyon, just based on the letter that we received today. So we'll probably need to bring those numbers down. I think we also, on Coyote Canyon in particular, because of the way that we're going to have to work through on the affordability side of things, we probably need to shift some of the units out of the extremely low and some of them into moderate. And that will also allow us to reduce the buffer that we need on the moderate side, which is higher than currently on the extremely low and very low. And so the other thing I wanted to point out real quick, we've received a few letters on specific properties. So there was a property owned by a company called Comac who's asked us to specifically remove their property. My sense is that if someone has asked us to specifically remove their property from the APN list, that would be appropriate to do so. I think the only APN listings we should have in order to provide the substantial evidence would be ones who have actually said yes. So I suspect we'll need to remove them. We also received one from 4340 Von Carmen asking to be removed, so we probably need to do the same thing on that APN. And then we received, I think it was yesterday, Fritz Duda's property over on the peninsula asked to be added. I would suggest we probably add it in. The reason I suggest that is because there's no guarantee that any of the properties that have been listed on the APN register that we're going to be submitting to the property or to the state will actually get built. Every property that's listed on that APN register is a property that is going to be required to go through its own project analysis, just like every other project going forward. And so my sense is listing someone who's asked to be listed is a good idea from a compliance standpoint. And then down the road, they have to go through the same process. They have to go through the same decision on whether they're going to be they still have to figure out, can they comply with our zoning code, with the state laws and general plan, et cetera. So anyway, I wanted to highlight those three, and everything I just said will substantially reduce the numbers that we're seeing on our whatever we would submit to HCD. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Brenner.
Yes, I was also going to wait till after public comments, but I have a few things that I could say now. I think we have a consensus on a few things, and one is that we appreciate the committee and all the work that you've done, and I think it's really important to note that none of us knew what we didn't know when this started, that this process has been evolving as we've gone along, and the state is continuing to change things. And they still are continuing to change things, and they're still considering bills that can impact all of this. So you really were given almost an impossible task of figuring out what to do, not knowing what the rules were going to be. So we appreciate all of your time and energy that went into that. I think we also have consensus that we really need to move forward on the general plan, that we're getting a lot of feedback that's telling us that we really need to. I know we've got staff time constraints, but that's really an important thing for us to move forward with. And the other thing I think we have consensus on is that we don't want to be first. We don't want to meet this deadline and be the first in line, and as Kevin said, turning in our homework early. We don't want to do that, and things can change as we go along on that too. So we may find things that are going to alter what we actually do turn in. The other thing I think that's really important is to recognize how complex this all is and how many factors there are to understand. Even just up here, since you've given your report, we're all over the board. I mean, we're talking about so many different topics all at one time, and that's why I feel that it's really important that we take each one of these things individually and we really delve into it and understand the whole ADU thing, we have a lot of learning to do on that. And I spoke to the Irvine Terrace Homeowners Association board a week or so ago, and you know, when they understand, everybody's against ADUs to start with, and then once they start to understand that we kind of get one-on-one credit for ADUs, it's not a matter of having to build multiple market rate units in order to get the credit for the affordable housing unit, then they start to look at it differently. And another thing that I was able to point out to them is this actually isn't new. My mother was doing ADUs before we even knew what ADUs were. She was widowed at 54. And when my dad passed away, fortunately he left her in a duplex in Corona Del Mar. She had a garage apartment upstairs. She had an illegal bachelor apartment downstairs, which she rented out. She also had a back bedroom with a separate entrance and a bathroom that she rented out to a UCI professor. And he was here during the week, and he went to his home on the weekend. It's like she had 4 rental units on her little R2 piece of property in Corona Del Mar. But she was a widow. She needed that income. And I think that's what we're going to discover with ADUs, is that not everybody in Newport Beach is rich. And once people understand this and understand how it benefits the property owner, not a developer, it benefits the property owner who is able to make their property work for them, and it also benefits the person who needs affordable housing, whether it's a family member or a student or an elderly relative, whatever. But anyway, we need a whole study session on that, and we need to get a lot more information out to the community on ADUs. That's just one. I mean, there are so many. We need to talk about this inclusionary policy, and I would really like to hear from Mike Costa, who's here, because we talked to him yesterday, Simone and Diane and I, on the phone, and there is so much that we don't understand about the inclusionary policy and financing and how 80-20 and 60-40 can work. And Mike made it really clear to point out that he's a for-profit builder. He's not a nonprofit builder, and these formulas work. And if they work and a developer can make money doing that, then we need to know how that works so that when we're talking about it, we're making wise decisions on our inclusionary policy. And that's just but we've got some deep dives to go into on a variety of topics here, and I'm hoping that you really educate us and the public. And I think as the public understands this all, they're going to be more interested. When they understand that, you know, if we did a 5% affordable housing unit to get to the numbers, we'd be approving like 14,000 units or something. And once you make them understand that, I think they're going to be a lot more interested than maybe they have shown up until this point. So, but I would really like to hear from Mike Costa to enlighten the council and the community on how this inclusionary policy works.
Thank you, Ms. Dixon.
Thank you. I agree with everything you said, Councilmember Brenner, and I hope we can hear from Mr. Costa before we go out to public comment. Just to echo your points on the ADUs, I think you're absolutely right. In fact, there are 2 being built in Lido, where I live, and those were proposed projects. They came in as 2 single-family homes that were carving up a 4-plex, and the Coastal Commission rejected it because of the de-densification. And so staff worked with these 2 owners, and they're putting junior ADUs in, which qualify as well, and it has a separate entrance, and you don't even know that it's there. Incidentally, one kind of overriding message to communicate to everyone about multiple units, and this is not to confuse these important issues, but the legislature is still drafting bills that are going to be laws that affect our density. And I've really taken special note around the community where there are multi-units within a residential community, and when they are designed to blend in with the homes, Lido has a number of them, at least a half a dozen multi-unit structures that have the frontage that look like a home and the side entrances just down the side. And you don't even know that they're multi-unit. So when we get to the point that we can develop standards about how homes and multi-unit complexes are built in our community, I hope we'll be able to do that. Let me just touch on a couple of things. Yes, we need to do a deep dive on ADU expansion. Also, when do we talk about the use of overlays? Is it during this process on the housing element, or we do it during land use?
Oh, it's during that land use plan, but it's not specifically for land use. It's part of our zoning.
So it's really down the road?
Yes.
But so when we've talked about an overlay for senior housing, which will be really positive to reach our numbers, but then that'll be beyond the time that HCD looks at our plan.
So our plan just says, come up with a ordinance, come up with something. It's a plan to comply. It's a plan to do more.
And then we'll find that way
Yes.
through. Okay. And I agree on inclusionary zoning. When I started to go up through this learning curve, I thought 10%, that's all we should do. But then when I realized, and we'll hear this from Mr. Costa, that maybe 20% or 30% really allows for a for-profit quality developer of affordable housing and market rate housing to come into the community, that might be a better approach. So we need to explore, and we should probably do something on inclusionary housing sooner rather than later, but ultimately get to the right number. And really understand more on the federal and state financial incentives. The buffer concept, I couldn't hear quite what you were saying. Are you for or against a buffer? 5%. Okay, I like that number. Okay, I agree with that. And as far as specific add-ins to what we're discussing, while I'm not opposed to a general concept that would bring more residential housing into our community, I'm reluctant to agree to that, and I don't agree with it at this point in the process, because when we started the process district by council district by council district, the residents of my district spoke very loudly and clearly where they wanted to see additional housing, and that was not on the peninsula. We're probably the most dense housing area in the whole city. So I want to be careful before we just plunk something in and say we're going to do this, because to do any proposed concept, building residential concept in that specific area where we've not studied, we'd have had no vetting process, we've had no analysis, we've had no resident input, it does potentially eliminate a marine service facility. So that is an issue that is concerning to all of us on the peninsula and in West Newport, to make sure we protect our marine services. So before we jump, I want to be supportive. I'm certainly supportive of additional residential housing where it can fit in my district, but no one has studied it. We haven't analyzed it. And to bolt it on during this kind of discussion, I do not think it's appropriate. It should go through a normal process. And at some point, it may be included in the housing element, but at this point, none of us have studied it. So I'm not supportive of that at this time, but ultimately, I could be. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Duffield.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, I want to say thank you to the Housing Committee and all of our staff for the amazing work you've done with this. And I agree with everything that's been said up here. I've been listening. And I did want to interject one element to the low and very low housing that I've heard, and I could be wrong, but there may be at a time grants and monies for developers for homeless housing in that low, very low element of housing. So I'm not sure that has, but I've heard it. I want to just make sure that we understand that could be a possibility. So when we're talking about low and very low, that might have some consequences that we are not thinking through. And the very low and very low consequences that Councilman Bloom brought up was very insightly. I agree with that. So these are consequences that are pretty grave. We have to be careful. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go to public comment, I'd just like to also thank Mr. Tucker and his committee. A total of 10 folks worked really hard on this, and continuing to do so. And I think it's also evident that the council has really gone to school on this. Certainly listening today, again, it just reinforces that to me. So I think it's really good. There's a sense that we're all going in the same direction. And I think the public is still asking hard questions and is very concerned, as public should be, about government doing anything. So it's all good. And I think everything that was set up here, was excellent. And the only thing I have to add, because I certainly don't need to pile on, is just my concern about getting villages out of these areas. And I've spoken to Mr. Tucker about this, and Mr. Tucker is kind enough to spend quite a bit of time with me, and I assume he spent some time with other council members. And it's great. One-on-one is such a luxury with someone that's got that body of knowledge and coming out of all this experience with the committee and with our residents. It's very hard in this process, I think, to drive what ultimately should be villages, right? In West Newport, the airport area, it's a little easier here at Newport Center. There's sort of a lot of services there, and that's good. But you really can't schedule a market or a restaurant or bar or dry cleaners. And so then you can't demand a landowner do that. But if we're going to plunk down, hundreds of units in an area, or work toward redeveloping West Newport, that's what we'd really like to see. So people could spend a weekend at home and have open spaces and have areas they can go and enjoy, and not necessarily get in their car, for a weekend. And that would be ideal. So we've got great villages in Newport Beach, and we need ideally to add more. And to the degree that we can do that, that would really be helpful. The worst case is we're just creating these bedroom communities that are not really livable in the sense that we all think of our places where we live, and we have access to these amenities. So some are more set up for that than others. But I think that's the real question, is we want the quality of life in these areas to be high. We want them to be places that people want to live, and we regard them on an equal footing to our other villages. That should be our goal ultimately. And I know Mr. Blom is, he's well aware of this, being in the businesses he's in. We've got to create vibrancy. They can't be just these places where the wind blows through and there's no one really out and doing things and enjoying life. Because the circulation side of this is really going to be something we need to deal with as well. And we need to be able to stay, be able to stay home and feel good about it. And the other thing that Mr. Tucker said, and I think is really to keep in mind here, is we're just making a lot of assumptions, and the best assumptions we can make. And we have to go with them. We have to start somewhere. But we're on a long road, and there's going to be bumps along the way and twists and turns. And so we just have to keep leaning into it, which I know we'll do along with all the residents, because we're all invested here, and we have a lot to lose if it's not done right. And that's certainly incumbent on all of us to get it right. So with that, we'll now hear public comment from those in the council chambers. Well, Mr. Costa can come up. He can lead off the public comments if he chooses to.
Good afternoon, Mayor and council members. My name is Michael Costa. I think you might have gotten a letter that I sent to try to help a little bit with this whole process, but this is a very daunting process for you to go through, and I understand that. I'm an affordable housing developer, for-profit. Been doing this for about 40 years. The company that I own now is a company that was started just about 30 years ago. And so we've had the opportunity to develop just about 30,000 units of affordable housing, half of which is here in the state of California, up and down the state. We take a lot of pride in what we do. We build market rate quality product that fits into just about any multifamily neighborhood. And we do that on purpose because we're long-term holders. So we're a lot different than not all of the affordable housing players, but most of them. So I was trying to lend some assistance in helping because there are some, first of all, I think inclusionary zoning is a way to look at this problem to help try to solve it. And the reason I say that is because if you start designating specific sites and areas to be 100% affordable, what happens is right now what's going on at the state level is we had a $4 billion bill passed in 2020 for affordable housing. That's why we're seeing a lot of the homeless communities and the very, very low income housing being built throughout the state. The state right now is trying to work on a second bill to come up in the next election, and it's about $10 billion. In addition to that money that's being there, the state is trying to push for affordable housing to have absolute up and down the state by right type of allowances. In addition to that, they're looking at trying to update CEQA for affordable housing so that they wouldn't have to go through most of the CEQA processes. So you can see what's happening in this state and how they're trying to push for affordable housing. And just a note with respect to any housing element in just about any city right now, if you missed your moderates, if you missed your above moderates, nobody's probably going to say much. The governor's not going to get upset. The HCD is probably not going to do a whole lot about that. But if you missed your low, very low, and mod areas in there, I can assure you that's what they're going after. And you've seen it. You've seen them attack other cities already on this front. I've had to come in and rush to help cities that got sued on this front and had to produce affordable housing quickly. And we've been able to come in and try to help them to do that, and we built 3 communities on that front already. So just keep in mind kind of those focuses. So back to some of the things that I talked to Councilmember Brenner and Dixon about yesterday, is there are specific financing programs for affordable housing that you've heard of, tax-exempt bond financing, 4% tax credits, 9% tax credits, things like that, that can be, I mean, I'm done?
Go ahead.
That can be used, right, to assist in, especially when you're doing these inclusionary zoning policies and trying to establish what percent at what targeting of income, residents, and rents and things like that, that can be utilized to help us developers, right, to offset the cost of reducing those rents under those mandates. And you want to make sure that you understand as much of that as you possibly can. I and a lot of others can help to make sure that you do, so that you can maximize that benefit to the developers and make it easier to develop that inclusionary zoning with the percentage of affordability that gets the offset from these financing programs. And there's a lot to that. It takes hours of education to get you through all of it, but it's really important to know that because I think it's a benefit in your case. It also, from an inclusionary standpoint, what you're able to do is, you've talked about different areas, and I'm not real familiar with each of the geographic areas of Newport Beach, but you talk about different percentages of affordability in those areas and what you might or might not want. The good thing about inclusionary zoning is that you can know it, when you know the financing that's there to try to help, it helps across the board. It isn't targeted in any geographic area, obviously. And if you can balance the affordability throughout the entire city from a requirement on the inclusionary front, which is basically multifamily development, right? Then it tends to even things out with respect to what happens to the value of the land when those are imposed on some landowners and maybe not some others. It helps to take away any kind of, somebody might want to point a finger to say, why do you want to put those people over in that area? You start to eliminate a lot of those types of issues. And so I encourage that, obviously, and I can help out and answer any questions that you'd like to ask outside of all that. There's a lot to this, obviously, but.
Thank you. We've got a couple questions. Ms. Brenner.
You had said yesterday to be careful with by right, And can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, what I was trying to propose here was going down the inclusionary zoning route versus trying to designate sites as 100% affordable. This state is pushing really hard. They believe we have about 1.5 million units short right now on the front of Lotamod, right? That alone. And so they're going to push and do everything they can and they're imposing this already. You can see it in your housing element requirements, right? To develop more affordable housing. And one of the things that they want to do is once an affordable housing developer comes in and starts to find a site that's zoned properly for their type of development, that affordable development, they want to give them complete by right from the state level that takes the control away from the local cities. And I don't believe in that. I understand your situation. I happen to live in Manhattan Beach, and I can tell you that city council in Manhattan Beach is freaking out over all of this because they're trying to get their housing element to be met. They don't have any vacant land anywhere, right? And they're trying to figure out how they're going to possibly make this happen too. And what I don't want to see is cities lose control. We're trying to figure out ways to build this element and create this situation in a manner that still maintains control. And when you're doing those inclusionary zoning types of programs, the good news is most of those market rate developers are building very nice product, right? High amenitized, nice amenities inside of the interiors of each of the units as well. And that benefits those affordable housing units. You will see them built to that same quality if you're going through that inclusionary. When you get into the 100% stuff, obviously you're trying to work with them and trying to bring that up. But I get nervous about the whole by right process that the state's trying to impose and eliminating CEQA. They literally, right now, there are bills being written to try to eliminate the CEQA process for affordable housing. So if you had a 100% affordable project, the state is trying to eliminate the CEQA, which I can't imagine that, but it is happening at the state level.
Thank you. Mr. Plum.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kosai. We appreciate the knowledge on that side. So, you guys have done some phenomenal building in California, 142 projects. I mean, that's pretty impressive. Are there comparable sites to Newport with land value? Because as I was looking through some of them, I think, they're definitely site-specific, but where are we in comparable land use to Newport?
There's part of the problem. No, you're good observation. So, and I meant to open up with that, right? The value, and because of the value of land in this area, and I have the same thing in my own hometown, right? I can't build affordable housing in Manhattan Beach. There's no way I can afford that kind of land. So the answer to your question is no. We try to get into as nice areas as we possibly can. Usually we get into the growth areas of cities that are still growing in their nice areas. No, the answer is no. We're not in that many high-end areas. It's very tough.
Ms. Dixon.
Thank you for being here today to answer these questions. Also, when you talk about wanting cities to retain as much control as possible, the governance, what are some of the areas of governance that we can hang on to, that the state can't take away from us?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if they can't. If you'll ever get to a place where they can't take something away, they're going to try. They're going to try as much as they possibly can. And their drive, you can see it. Their drive is to the low and the low to mod housing. They want those numbers. That's the most important thing to them. Granted, we need housing overall, but they're pushing as hard as they can on that front. And so they're going to look to do past bills and things like that that are going to allow them to get those units built no matter what city you're in or otherwise. And the way they'll do that is if they pass which this has to be voter approved, right? The $4 billion proposition that was approved a couple of years ago, that was voter approved. And they did that on the backs of homelessness, right, is that everybody knows there's a homeless problem here in the state of California. Some of the number one city in the nation happens to be Los Angeles with the number of homeless people. And so there's a huge problem there. Well, that's what got the voters' attention, and that's what got them to approve this $4 billion bill. I don't know that they will be able to get the $10 billion approved, to be honest with you, because I think that we're looking already at some tax changes that are looking like they're going to come down from the federal government and things like that, that will change, I think, the mindset of most voters. But, you know, I'm not an expert on that front. I just, you know, see that happening. But if you combine the money with the by right type of situations and them trying to force affordable housing on just about every jurisdiction, that $10 billion will go a long ways to mitigate the cost of land in Newport Beach, and the cost of land in Manhattan Beach, and places like that. And then we're liable to see more of the push of you know, maybe some very low income and maybe even some homeless in those areas. And the way to try to defeat that really is to get your low and mod numbers in through your inclusionary zoning processes, where there are still some multifamily developers wanting to build multifamily here, that we can get those numbers in and try to meet those sooner rather than later. Is my only advice that I can give you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank
you're
you.
welcome.
All right, and now we'll just continue here with the public hearing. In the council chambers first, and then we can go out to the community room and telephone.
Good afternoon, Mayor Avery and members of the council. My name is Nancy Skinner, and I have a few thoughts, but I can't get them all in 3 minutes, so I will go very quickly. I'm going to just drop this one thought, which hopefully will be answered none on my minutes, and that is Mr. Muldoon had mentioned about are there any penalties? And I thought I heard no, and I've heard opposite otherwise, and it seemed to me that the penalties came at the end of 10 years, and if that's the case, we ought to know about it, but maybe I'm totally wrong. So it was what I had heard, that we don't have any penalty, we just have to plan for all these many residences, but we don't have to build them. But if we haven't built them is where the penalties come in. So that I will hope you'll answer for me later. I hope I'm wrong. And the main thing I wanted to talk about was affordable housing. In fact, it was nice to hear Mr. Costa's comments. Thank you very much for that. And also Councilwoman Dixon's interest in it. And I'm hoping that maybe there could be some sort of special, relaxing, everybody who wants to come and talk about it kind of meeting. It would be very helpful. I have been wondering why our city hasn't taken the effort to see what they've done in cities like Aspen. What am I thinking? The one up in, I even wrote it down because I never can remember their name. But the special places up near the Tetons and that area, Jackson Hole was what I was trying to remember, and other areas. I know a little bit about Aspen, and so they have housing, and you already may know this, those of you who've been there, for their citizens who work in the city. And so my thought on the 100% housing, Councilman O'Neill, that I was mentioning earlier, I believe you got my note on that, I don't know for sure, but and I think that the landfill area where there are 22 acres available for development, although it might be hard to do it, the remainder could be a golf course and be pretty to be next to it, so they may not feel badly about being next to a landfill, wherever they put the trash. But if you had seen the senior housing that we built, that's worked out just fine, and they're all seniors. The ones we did for the 12 people on the peninsula, those are all for veterans, and those are all the same. I think if you kind of made it that kind of a thing where it's some people who work in the city, and certainly we have a lot of people work in our city, I don't know if they would be interested. When they first come in, they might, and then maybe not. So I wouldn't want to shut that out altogether. And the only other question I wanted to ask probably could be asked at another time, but I've wondered about this. When you have developers put aside certain amount of units for affordable, I don't know if they're being sold, But if they're being sold, how do they keep them affordable if they are being sold? That's my question. If they are being rented, I understand that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. I'm going to have to leave a little early because I am the president of the Harborview Hills Community Association, and our association has a board meeting in about 45 minutes. So anyway, my name is Deborah Allen. Our issue seems to pale by comparison to the Herculean matters before you. But there are 150 homes in my association, 146, and there's the two Broadmoor associations, which are also part of Harborview Hills, with about 120. So we're talking about 600 people. Those 600 people think this is really, really important, and that's the site plan ordinance. We're not asking you to change anything, to do anything, to implement anything that's new, but we would appreciate it if you would express, hopefully like Mayor Pro Tem Muldoon did, that you are interested in, that you have no interest in changing the site plan ordinance. It is a 32-foot height limit that has been in place for 50 years, since 1971. It came out of an agreement between the Irvine Company and the neighbors who live in my development. And it is in the planned community texts for all of the developments in Corporate Plaza and Corporate Plaza West. But I don't think this is premature, because although you've had very few developers who have taken the city up on the invitation to participate in this overlay zoning for residential, 5 of them are under the site plan. 3 of them are right along Pacific Coast Highway between Avocado and Newport Center Drive, and the other 2 are in Corporate Plaza West. And our concern is that if you don't tell them now that you want to continue the site plan ordinance, they may think that the overlay zoning for housing means that it would be okay to build high-rises. And that would really change the complexion of all of Newport Center. And I don't think that is in any way what you were thinking. But if you can simply reinforce that it's been in place for 50 years and you have no interest in changing it, then down the road, when we get into the development standards, we can talk about specifying how we go about doing that. The Planning Commission agreed with our position, and if you look at their minutes on page 10, bottom half of the page, it starts out with Deborah Allen said, and there's just a couple paragraphs where the commissioners expressed their desire to maintain the ordinance. It's been a city policy for decades, and in some cases, in some of your cases, probably before you were born, not before I was born, but before I lived here. So anyway, we would appreciate it if you would simply reinforce that that is something that you'd like to preserve. Then we can go on with the other complicated issues. Ours is very simple, but it's very important to about 600 people. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor and members of the City Council. It's nice to be back. It's been a long time since we've been here. I know you love to see us just as much as we're happy to be here, so thank you. My name is Nancy Scarborough, and some days I feel lucky that I did not win the election. Today is easier to be on this side of the dais than to be in your seats, so. I want to thank first the Housing Committee, chaired by Nancy Gardner, and the current Housing Committee, chaired by Larry Tucker, for carrying out the tasks that they were assigned. I've attended every outreach meeting in person and all of the Zoom meetings from the beginning that have been held. For the last year and a half, I've been learning a lot about housing and affordable housing in particular. I'm a planner by profession, so some of this may have been easier for me than others. Today, before you, you have the proposed housing element, and most of you have had little exposure to the process and have received education supporting the direction you are being asked to support. After hearing from an affordable housing professional and reading the myriad of comments that you've received, it seems time to pause and consider an alternate plan. On behalf of the Good Neighbors Newport group, I've submitted an option 3 plan for consideration. We ask that you direct staff to consider it and at least tell you why the whole plan or parts of it won't work. We believe that option 3 is prudent and saleable to the community. I would argue that the proposed plan, option 2, is not saleable to the community. There's probably a lot of opposition to it. Our option 3 is not the least worst plan. Unfortunately, that's the best we can do, but it provides a plan for senior housing, permanent supportive housing for homeless, and acknowledges ADUs which currently exist all over the community. It also provides low and very low income apartments at 60-40 ratio instead of the 95-5, which gets us to the higher numbers that we see in option 2. We believe this plan is achievable and defensible. Thank you for your service.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Mayor Avey, members of the City Council, Sean Matzler with Cox Castle and Nicholson. Here tonight, at least for now, representing Lido Partners, which is the owner of the Fritz Duda property on the peninsula. Lido Partners is requesting that the city include that property in the housing element by adding it to the site inventory list. We submitted a letter to the city earlier this week to that end. Via Lido Plaza, as it's called, is a gateway to the peninsula and includes Lido Theater, Fable and Spirit, Bear Flag, West Marine, and other retailers and restauranteurs. It's approximately 5 acres in size. The owner is planning a future redevelopment for the plaza that would incorporate a mixed-use overlay and include maintaining the existing retail and restaurant, multifamily residential component in back and above existing retail, a village green and theater, and all this would be centered around the iconic Lido Theater, which opened in 1939 and which the owner is currently renovating. Part of the plan we're proposing would keep the existing commercial FAR, or the 0.5 FAR. So to address Councilwoman Dixon's point about losing one of those major anchor tenants, the idea would be to keep a lot of the existing commercial on site. We believe that this residential use is similar to the existing and surrounding uses. To the north, Lido Marina Village has zoning which allows 26 units per acre. To the south, Cannery Village has zoning which allows 26 units per acre. To the east, along Via Porto, is a MUV zone which also allows 26 units per acre, and a planned community tax which allows 3-story residential. And finally, to the south, the draft housing element is proposing to increase zoning from 15 to 30 units per acre. The owner's willing and looking forward to offering an affordable housing component that's consistent with what the city's proposing elsewhere in the city. So this would consist of 15% low income and 20% moderate income. So in closing, I would again ask that the city update the housing element to designate the property with 30 dwelling units per acre and a 0.5 FAR mixed-use zoning, and add this site to the site inventory list and include it in the EIR. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Mayor Avery, members of the council, my name is Jim Mosher. I submitted a serious comment to you in writing. I want to make an even more serious comment now, because I don't think staff has adequately impressed on you the seriousness of the crisis our state is facing that triggered the need for more housing. The great state of California is, for the first time in its history, facing the possibility of losing people. I don't think I need to impress on you how dire the consequences of a reduction in population could be. With fewer people, we run a risk of reduced water consumption, less pollution, less traffic, lowered greenhouse emissions, and maybe even less crime. And worst of all, we would be the laughing stock of a world that understands growth is always good. The solution is as obvious as the problem, and the problem is the high cost and taxes that are driven by high property values. What we need to do to solve the problem is obvious. You need, I need, we all need to do everything we can to reduce property values in Newport Beach. That needs to be our #1 priority. If you've ever seen my house, you know that I'm trying to do my part. I'm deferring maintenance so that its resale value will go down. And I could do more. I could break a few windows. I could park abandoned cars in my driveway. I could leave trash in the street. John Wayne Airport has long done its part to lower property values in my part of town. And you too could, through this housing amendment, do your part. Please give us what we want. More people, more traffic, more pollution, and lower property values. California is depending on you. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody want to follow that? All right. So any other further public comments? Oh, there we go. Zach.
Good evening. My name is, good evening, Honorable Mayor and City Council members. My name is Max Johnson. I'm a 26-year resident of Newport Beach and currently reside in District 1 and the Balboa Peninsula Point community. I'm here this evening during the study session to voice my support for the Good Neighbors option number 3 to meet the RENA requirement. I do agree with the rationale for considering 1,000 ADUs to meet the RENA requirement. I would like to add and support the decision to ask the city to stall the process of submitting the draft housing element and have practicing affordable housing experts tell the council and the residents why option number 3 can be done and how it can work. I think there were a lot of really great points this evening, and I think that it is needed for the city just to take pause, and I think more residents to also become more informed and engaged in this process. I think that the more time spent in this matter, the better for the long term of our ultimate decision for this matter. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Do we have any other public comment? All right, someone else here? Oh, Mr. Tanner.
Thank you, David Tanner. I had the opportunity to listen a little bit tonight to your earlier discussions. So I had a few comments. You may have seen the written comments I submitted earlier today in those. I think it's very important that prior to the time that the council takes action, that it understands the full impact of the housing element, and it can't do that without understanding the full impact that the housing element is going to have on the general plan in the city. It's just, in my mind, not prudent for you to take action. So it's also my belief that the city is not going to be able to comply. That's just my belief. So I don't see that the city should be giving any more than the bare minimum that it's required to give to HCD, because I believe HCD is, as some of you have commented, is going to say thank you, but we want more. And we're going to have nothing left in reserve. So I think the city should be doing some things right now that you haven't talked about yet, and I want to identify what those might be. I don't think the city is going to want new housing of any economic level in areas that are subject to high fire risk, or areas that are subject to flooding, or earthquake hazard, or other natural hazards. So I think the city, as part of this planning, this general plan update, needs to update its general plan and say, here, we're not going to have housing in these areas, no matter what. We don't want them. It's not prudent to do that. So when the state comes down and everything I believe that you propose, the state is going to require based on their history. You look at it now, we cannot redesignate a residential piece of property to something other than residential. The state won't let us. They passed a law. This is what we're up against. And so if we propose something, the state is going to not let us take it back. So we have to be protective of the quality of life. And when we talk about more ADUs, which I think is something that's very worthy of talking about, remember, those ADUs, they don't necessarily, and you're talking about reducing fees, they don't necessarily pay their fair share. So who pays that? The rest of the residents in the city through parking problems and school districts and fees and things like this that they just don't pay for. The rest of us pay for that. So it's not free when we're doing this. So I just wanted you to consider that. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other public comment? All right, do we have any phone calls? 2. Hello, please mute your device and go ahead.
Hi, this is Debbie Stevens, resident of Corona Del Mar, and also on the Housing Element Update Committee. So first I want to say thank you very much to city staff and the consultants that helped us prepare the housing element. It was very difficult and complicated to do, but I don't think we suffered from good advice. So my comments are brief because I made them in writing before. But first of all, I would have been there if I knew that we were going to be able to be in the chamber, but I didn't know that. So I was very encouraged to hear the comments that council had tonight. They really kind of go along with what my comments were. First of all, I look at this, it was almost 100% buffer. Not quite that much on low-income housing, but still it's huge. And I don't want to see that kind of a buffer. So really support the comments that I heard regarding a smaller buffer. I'd like to see the number capped. It's really hard to say how much is in this housing element when we're looking at 4,800 units, but really it's much higher than that, and I would prefer to see some kind of cap. I know the zoning overlays are what we're looking for, but it would be nice to see those, in a more concrete form in this housing element. And I believe we should recognize some of the existing ordinances, like the current site plan ordinance. And also, that also protects views coming down MacArthur. There are public views, and those are considered to be a scenic route, too. So just want to say that. I'm very happy to hear the comments about the ADUs. My thought, and we had talked about it in the committee often, it was more like a 700 or 800 unit range would be appropriate. But there was a lot of positive comments on that, so I'll keep that. You guys are on the right track with that. So, and then I also concur with Councilwoman Brenner's desire to restart the general plan update process as well. So, and one more comment is that we do have some sites in the city that are industrial and that they are currently on the sites list, and I just don't agree with that. One of those is a metal plater, which is about the worst place that you can put housing. So I don't support changing the zoning on some of the industrial properties in the city. Other than that, you guys have a difficult task. I'm glad I'm not the person that is making the decision on this, but it's been a very interesting process to work on. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Another call? Hello, please mute your device and go ahead.
Hi, Mayor Avery and council members. My name is Dorothy Krause. I want to thank all of you on the council for your obvious research of all of this and your great perspectives and contributions on this very important process and ultimate outcome we face in our community. I have participated in many of the Housing Element Update Advisory Committee meetings and workshops, and like many have concluded that the draft housing element is very complicated, and it will likely have a long-lasting impact on the quality of our lives and character of our beach town. A working group started by Jean Watt and Nancy Scarborough has met over the last year and a half, and they have come up with ideas to meet the state-mandated RENA allocation with the least impact on Newport Beach. And this is option 3, which I believe was included in your agenda packet tonight. Their approach has been to engage experts on viable, affordable housing development, and they have come up again with this option 3. these concepts have been touched on by council members Dixon and Brenner tonight, and I really appreciated that Mr. Costa was available to also make comments, because many of the concepts he touched on are incorporated into the analysis that the Good Neighbors Group have presented in their option 3. So I respectfully request that we please pause and make this a thoughtful process to fully understand the consequences of what you are being asked to submit to HCD in our draft housing element. Thank you very much for your time and consideration, and have a good night.
Thank you. Great. All right. Seeing no further public comment, we are back to the council, and we can hear from Mr. Muldoon.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Briefly, I just want to add that about the location of some of these sites that we're considering, I think it's beneficial to be flexible and also consider the different geographical restraints that green light could put. So I also would support having an increase at Banning and Coyote Canyon and potentially Lido Village as potential sites. I think we ought to keep as many options on the table. And having these sites considered now will allow us to revert back to them if the state were to come forward and say you need to come up with something much more quickly for whatever reason they reject the first omitted site. So I think now is the time to look at all those locations. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Dixon.
Thank you, Mayor. Number of speakers, and as well as Dorothy Kraus, just referred to option 3. Mr. Churches, how would we want to at least present this for further review? How would you suggest we handle this?
Thank you, Councilmember Dixon and Mayor Avery. I think it'd be a good time for me just to summarize what we've heard, just kind of the consensus for on the changes for the housing element. Was that
Right.
okay?
And I would also like council members to reaffirm any direction for you as well
Can
during
I just,
this time.
okay, before you do that, then let me
okay.
I just had a couple more comments. Well, I guess this is part of the affirmation process, because I do support whatever we could do with Banning Ranch, and that was part of the community vetting process where residents put their little stickers on, or Post-it notes on Banning Ranch, airport area, Coyote. Lido Village was not part of that process, so I will not support that at this time, because the residents of that community have not weighed in and vetted their point of view on that. I also definitely support the site plan ordinance preservation process, so I am supportive of that. So I'll now defer to you, Mr. Churches, for that explanation.
Thank you. So, Councilmember Dixon, your question was how do we reconcile the option 3 from the residents that proposed? I want to spend a little bit more time. There's some things here that we can include as policies in our housing element, with encouraging more of that senior affordable housing and homeless permanent supportive housing too. So I know here that they've kind of indicated a kind of a cap or total of housing units. I think those are going to be policies. What I think is going to be important is I summarize what I've heard from the council. A few things, and it ties to the option 3 discussion too. So the council's, what I've heard is that it's supportive to just delay this. We don't want to be first, and we, from a staff standpoint, we completely understand that. There is a lot of support to boost our ADU count, and that's consistent with the option 3 that the community members have kind of proposed. For the ADUs, to be aggressive with ADUs, I want to study it. I want to take that pause time so I can have our consultants kind of survey the community, come back to us with a document. And it's going to help us with HCD to make that argument of why our ADUs are at 1,000 or at 800. So that's going to work. I did hear to reduce the buffer down to 5%. I think there's consistency with that statement. There is consistency with Banning Ranch to increase the dwelling unit count up to 50, and let's see how those kind of housing units kind of shake out. Overall, the council wants to reduce the density of the airport area, reduce the density of Newport Center. So doing these ADU boosting, lowering the buffer, and boosting Banning Ranch is going to help reduce the airport area and Newport Center. There's also discussion for Coyote Canyon to kind of reduce that low and very low units, kind of readjust it up to the moderate, and if it's okay, even boost that density if it's needed. there was discussion with regards to removing some of the sites, those property owners that don't want to be in the process. And I'm hearing a little bit kind of a split discussion on the Lido Village, whether to include that or not to include that. So I'd like to get a little bit more feedback from the council on that. And with regards to the discussion on inclusionary zoning, that's something that we'll have further discussions on. We don't have to have more discussion on this housing element. With regards to kicking off the general plan, that's something we've heard and we're focusing on after we kind of clean up and do our updates. And I think that kind of summarizes everything I've heard so far today.
Great. Does council, have we missed anything here? All right, and then what about including Lido Village? Any?
I mean, I'm in full support to include Lido Village on this.
All right. Do we need to vote on that? Is everyone in support? And then we'll vote on the whole package?
Well, to be clear, we're only talking about one property. It's an APN. So it's worth reminding everybody kind of real quickly how this works because it's helpful. HCD changed their standards this past time in this cycle to make sure that we had to go through and try to find as many specific properties as possible, and you would go down into the assessor's parcel number in order to then ask them, a property owner, would you be willing to say that you're planning on adding residential onto your property in the next housing cycle, and if you are, how many and at what percentage are you planning on doing affordable? And so anytime someone came forward and said, yes, we put them into the housing element, the APN that would go along with trying to find substantial compliance on this. It's not that any of those projects would be approved. Obviously, the only thing we know right now is that they would like to or plan to put a certain number of housing. They've got to go through any normal process. So no one gets approved by putting this on, but it does give us more compliance path toward the process. So none of these, no APN has been vetted for project status. That's not what the Housing Element Update Committee did. No one has even looked at Coyote Canyon and said this is what we'd be willing to approve.
Right.
And when people were putting the stickers on Coyote Canyon, they thought that the entire green area was open. So there's a discussion here that I would just point out that literally any property owner who came forward and said that they'd be willing to put their name or their property on this for submission to HCD, we have said yes, and we've put it on there. That's it. So I think that any property, I think we should stay consistent. Any property owner that comes forward and says that they'd want this to be listed, should be listed, but they'd still have to go through the same property. So that's my position on.
Okay,
on this
so
one.
Lido Village has done that, right?
Well,
They
first
have,
of all, may I just
Yeah,
comment?
please.
There's been public discussion. We've been in this process for 2 years. As a representative for this district, I represent our residents. They have not expressed a desire to do that. It may come further in the process, but anyone who's been able to be part of the public process over the 50 meetings and discussions that have been held, it's been possible to submit that, of course, for review and comment by the community. This hasn't been done. I think if you just bolt that on, then it's kind of just established it's going to happen. I think Mr. Masler said 150 units be proposed for that small part of Lido. No one's looked at the traffic. No one's looked at the parking structure, West Marine. There are just too many questions that I have that I will just hold my opinion and let this go through the normal vetting process. The property owner certainly could right tomorrow submit a general plan amendment and start that process. So this housing element is not going to delay that desire on the part of the developer. If they just want to go through the normal process, they certainly can do that, and it would go through the Planning Commission and all of that. But 150 units in that small little area that is already dense, I would take a pause, and that needs to have some community vetting. Thank you.
Ms. Brenner.
Brad, I need clarification on something. I don't think that we're supposed to be voting on this tonight, are we?
No, we're not. We're just trying to see. There's been a couple of folks that have supported a recommendation to staff.
Because
look at this.
I would support us looking at that in the future, but not adding it to anything tonight. I think we need to get more clarification and look at it in the future, as we do on several other things. We need, the site plan ordinance needs to be talked about in more detail when we're specifically focused on that. We need to talk about workforce housing. We need to talk about objective standards, and definitely the ADUs and the inclusionary policy have to be discussed in detail. And the other thing, that when is the circulation element coming to us? Because that's a big factor in our entire city's planning.
So that'll come in May.
So, yeah, so that's another, I mean, we've got a lot of work to
Is
do.
this direction you're giving to staff right now?
No, I'm just saying those are the things that I want to know more about in the future.
All right. So I just want to be clear about Simone's list, that we're,
Well, Council Member, Mayor Avery, maybe it's just a straw vote on
right.
just
That's
the
what I'm trying to get to, so.
Okay, thank you.
Right, and maybe on this item with this specific APN, that could also be, I mean, we're coming back with the set of items where we're looking at the ADUs, you know,
Sure.
the different, the factors, the buffer factor and all that. We can also come back with, you know, these, you know, the Lido Village site too, when that comes back too, at that time, to have the, like, more of a formal vote as the housing element goes to be approved
Okay.
at a later time. That could be a way to look at this, and that gives time for some more input
So we'll hold off
on
on
that
that.
parcel site.
Okay. All right. So did everybody hear the list from Mr. Burgess? And are we good? Lido Village is out. All right. So,
Well, it'll be considered and brought back
right.
at a later time.
We're just authorizing resources toward Simone's list, right, to run that down. Okay, so a show of hands.
I don't think that's the right process. My residents have not weighed in on this.
Lido Village is not in this.
Okay, and I support that.
All right.
Just to be clear, when you use the term "my residence," I don't understand that at all, because, yeah, I think it's very important, because everybody remembers we're a district, we're
Our
not.
residents,
Okay,
our residents.
But it's important to say that,
All right,
okay?
all right, but I will say, and when we had the
Sorry, hang on.
workshops,
I'm
the
sorry.
charrettes.
Hang on one second, I'm not done.
There
with
were
that.
District 1
Ms. Dixon,
residents who
Ms.
weighed
Dixon,
in.
I'm not done yet. What I'm saying, which is important to understand as we're working through this, because to Ms. Brenner's point, it's important to, so everything you just listed, we will be talking about. It's just not part of the draft housing element. So I agree, we're going to be talking about all of that. And that's why I want to make sure we're staying really, really focused on what the task at hand is, because if, I mean, it's sort of a distraction talking about even a specific parcel, because it's, again, it's not even an issue where this would be brought to us on a project basis. Had they submitted the letter that they sent 2 days ago, 3 months ago, they'd be listed on the draft housing element right now. That's just kind of, I mean, anyone who said yes, anyone who said list my property is on there. That's the point of the discussion on the APN side of things, but it doesn't mean they get built. And that's why it's important, we're just coming back around on this discussion, that nothing, we're not approving any projects as part of this housing element. It's trying to get to a point of substantial compliance with HCD, and that's it, period. So I want to make sure I'm pointing that out. Thanks.
And we'll do.
Oh, yeah, just want to say, the 150 is new to me. I'm not addressing 150 at all. I'm not addressing 5. I'm addressing simply that this one property owner wants to have his part of the property considered. I support that. I support as many properties that want to be considered as possible, not only for planning, but for backup if for some reason the state rejects what we submit. And there's, you know, it's not necessarily a vote on a project. We don't have a project. We just have landowners saying that they're interested in having some component of the housing element placed on their property. So, just so we're clear though, did you poll us on that specific location being considered? Because I guess it's supposedly not in the list, but I do want to indicate to you, and I know my colleagues do, that we do want that location considered.
So I think the item for just discussion's sake, that we will communicate with the community and bring it back to further discussion with the council.
Okay.
We have time.
I understand. Mr. Mayor, I'd like to make a motion, to have that location considered. And doesn't mean we're approving any locations, but I don't, staff will have a chance to have an input, but, or I'm asking you to do a straw poll specifically on that item, so it directs staff so that they can consider it now, and that incorporates talking to the community. That's great, but I don't know why this landowner is not being considered.
Or you could do it on the larger principle of if a property owner wants to be considered, have their property considered, that they should be potentially included, maybe do it on the larger principle.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. Yeah.
Maybe straw vote that issue.
So whatever the mayor would like, I'm flexible, but I don't know why we're not considering this one request. I'm not saying I'm in favor, by the way. I want to consider all options.
Okay, so that's a motion, Mr. Muldoon? Do we have a second?
It'd just be a straw vote. It's just a straw vote.
Right. So,
Can I get clarification first on the larger list minus specifically Lido Village?
Right.
Is that unanimous? Except Lido Village. But that larger list.
So let me just, Simone went through a summary of the points that he was given direction on, and I think everybody was in agreement about it, except for this last point about what properties are being considered to be added to, the housing element. And so you're going to straw vote that separately. Does that accurately reflect where we're at?
yes. Okay.
And that vote is?
Simone's original list?
Correct. That's 7-0. Thank you.
All right, and then we have the Lido project. Mr. Muldoon?
Whether it's Lido or any location that wants to be considered, I'll defer to you. So we're talking about a process. It's not site-specific. I have no feelings about what's done at this site. It's that I want the ability for all sites to be considered before we sign off. Does that make sense? So why don't we just make it any site that wants to be considered, that they can submit it. It's not necessarily this one. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, I just assume they are being considered. It's just a question of when they arrive and the public outreach before bringing them on board, right?
And everyone's in agreement with that? It sounded like you were.
I apologize. Can I just seek clarification, because I've been been really involved in this process already, and I just need to make sure we're consistent with if up until right now, the APNs were listed as part of the larger package that would be submitted to HCD. Any property owner that said that they were willing to convert their property to housing and then listed out the number of units and then the number of affordable units within that is listed as in our draft housing element under a package that we will provide to HCD. So are you saying that we would continue that practice going forward for anyone coming forward before we submit the draft to HCD? Is that what you're saying, Mr. Muldoon? Okay, then yes, I understand. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah, and we're not specifically saying any development, we're just saying any.
Right.
That's fine. Okay, I support that.
And the straw vote is unanimous, 7-0.
Okay. We get there eventually. Let's go ahead, and we have public comments on agenda and non-agenda items.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of the City Council. I hadn't planned on speaking about this tonight. I'm sorry for the confusion you had before. Like Nancy Scarborough and Larry Tucker and several of us, we've attended every single meeting. One of the things that just happened that you might not have caught was that the property owner dictated the density to you when all the properties around it are at 26 and they asked for 30. That's the part that wasn't vetted at a public meeting. So I implore you, when you send this to the staff, to come back, list it as an APN, but allow the public to participate in the density. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments on agenda or non-agenda items? Do we have any phone calls? Okay. Seeing none? Mr. Hart, do you have an announcement?
Yes, the City Council will adjourn to closed session to discuss one matter of existing litigation, and the title of that is Richard Voss versus City of Newport Beach. And they'll also meet with the labor negotiators regarding negotiations with the Newport Beach Police Association. All is set forth on the agenda under item number 4. Thank you.
Okay, we're adjourned, and we'll meet back at 7:10.